At 55, the soul begins to prepare for freedom. Carl Jung's timeless teaching. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about childhood trauma or dream interpretation. It was about the death that happens at 55, a death modern society has conspired to hide from you. While the world obsesses over anti-aging creams and retirement portfolios, Jung uncovered something far more terrifying. At 55, a psychological death occurs that most people never survive consciously. They simply become walking corpses, mechanically moving through the last decades of existence without ever truly living. This isn't metaphor. This is biological and spiritual fact. Jung observed thousands of patients and noticed a pattern that shook him to his core. Around age 55, the psyche initiates a complete inversion of everything that made the first half of life successful. The qualities that built your career must now be sacrificed. The persona that won you relationships must be shed like dead skin. The identity you've defended for decades must die. But here's what Jung discovered that modern psychology desperately tries to conceal. This death isn't the end. It's preparation for the soul's ultimate purpose, a freedom so complete that it makes your entire first half of life look like imprisonment. The problem? Society has zero interest in you discovering this freedom. Think about it. The entire economic system depends on you remaining productive, consuming, striving, achieving. The entire cultural narrative celebrates youth, expansion, accumulation. The thought that at 55 you should begin withdrawing, simplifying, and turning inward threatens everything our civilization worships. So they rebranded Jung's profound teaching into the trivial midlife crisis. Red sports cars and affairs, desperate attempts to recapture youth. They made it a joke, a cliché, something to be embarrassed about rather than a sacred initiation into the soul's deepest purpose. Jung wrote in his private papers, "The second half of life does not signify ascent, unfolding increase, but death." A human being would certainly not grow to be 70 or 80 years old if this longevity had no meaning for the species. The afternoon of human life must also have a significance of its own. Most people never find that significance because they're still trying to live the morning's program in the afternoon. They're still measuring themselves by achievement, status, and productivity when the soul is screaming for something entirely different. What is that something? Jung called it individuation, but not the individuation of youth. This is a completely different process. Later life individuation demands ego death, shadow reclamation, and a confrontation with mortality that most people would rather avoid at any cost. The tragic truth? Most people at 55 face the invitation to this transformation and say no. They double down on their persona instead of releasing it. They accumulate more instead of simplifying. They stay busy instead of becoming present. And by saying no, they doom themselves to what Jung called the unlived life, arriving at death with the soul still in chains. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical practice. Successful men and women in their 50s and 60s coming to him with inexplicable depression, anxiety, psychosomatic illness. They had everything society promised would bring happiness, wealth, status, family, achievement. Yet they felt hollow, dead, meaningless. When Jung explored their psyches, he found the same thing every time: the soul in rebellion. The self, Jung's term for the totality of who you really are, was demanding freedom from the ego's tyranny. But the ego, terrified of its own death, held on tighter. This created what Jung called an internal war. The more the ego resists the natural transition, the more the soul escalates its rebellion. Depression becomes the soul's weapon. Anxiety becomes its alarm. Physical illness becomes its final resort when all other signals are ignored. Jung wrote, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie." This is the forbidden teaching. At 55, everything that was true becomes a lie. Your identity, a lie. Your accomplishments, dust. Your importance, ego inflation. Your responsibilities, soul prisons. The qualities that made you successful in the first half actively prevent your freedom in the second half. Your rationality must give way to intuition. Your productivity must give way to contemplation. Your expansion must give way to simplification. Your doing must give way to being. This is why Jung said the soul begins to prepare for freedom at 55. It's not that you become free instantly. It's that the preparation process begins, a process that will take the rest of your life if you have the courage to undertake it. Most don't. Most people at 55 look at this invitation and feel pure terror, because accepting it means voluntarily destroying everything you've built, everything you've identified with, everything you thought made you valuable. Society reinforces this terror by treating later life as decline. Retirement is framed as the end of your useful years rather than the beginning of your soul's true work. Aging is treated as a medical problem to be solved, rather than a spiritual passage to be honored. Elderhood is seen as irrelevance rather than the culmination of individuation. Jung knew this was backwards. He knew that if you did the work, the second half of life offered psychological and spiritual riches that made the achievements of youth look pathetically small. He knew that genuine wisdom, integration, and peace only become possible after ego death. He knew that real freedom, freedom from opinion, from achievement need, from persona, from fear, only comes to those willing to die psychologically at midlife. But he also knew the cost of refusing this death. He saw it in patient after patient, the living corpses who mechanically went through motions until biological death mercifully ended their suffering. The bitter elders who poisoned everyone around them with resentment. The ones who awakened at 70 or 80 to realize they'd wasted the entire second half clinging to the first half's values. Most tragically, Jung observed that refusing the psychological death often precipitated premature biological death. Heart attacks in driven executives who wouldn't slow down, cancer in people carrying decades of unintegrated shadow, strokes in those who couldn't release control. The body, Jung believed, rebels when the psyche's developmental needs are chronically ignored. This isn't punishment, it's design. The second half of life has its own purpose, and that purpose cannot be fulfilled using the first half's tools. You cannot achieve your way to wisdom. You cannot produce your way to peace. You cannot perform your way to integration. At 55, the soul begins whispering a terrifying invitation. Let go, release, die. Trust that something greater than ego is waiting on the other side of surrender. Most people hear this whisper and turn up the volume on their first half patterns. They work harder, acquire more, prove themselves again and again. They mistake the soul's call for failure rather than recognizing it as the next evolutionary stage of human development. Jung spent the last 30 years of his life, from age 55 until his death at 85, exploring and documenting this transition. He lived it himself. He watched others succeed and fail at it. And he left us a map. But that map has been buried, trivialized, and misunderstood. The modern self-help industry turns Jung's profound teaching into affirmations and visualizations. Mainstream psychology reduces it to cognitive reframing. Popular culture transforms it into jokes about midlife crisis. The truth remains forbidden. At 55, You're invited to die so your soul can finally live. And this death, far from being something to fear or avoid, is the greatest gift your psyche will ever offer you. The question is, will you accept the invitation? Or will you spend your remaining decades defending a false self that was only ever meant to be temporary? This script will give you Jung's map for navigating the death and rebirth of later life. But be warned, understanding this teaching will change how you see everything about aging, achievement, identity, and purpose. Once you know what's really happening at 55, you cannot unknow it. You'll see modern society's obsession with productivity and youth for what it really is, a collective conspiracy to avoid the soul's ultimate purpose. You'll recognize that the depression and meaninglessness plaguing so many people over 50 isn't pathology. It's the psyche's invitation to freedom that's being systematically ignored. And you'll understand why Jung believed this transition was so important that resisting it constituted the greatest tragedy of human life, dying without ever becoming who you truly are. Let's begin with the problem, the way modern culture has completely misunderstood and trivialized what Jung was actually teaching about the second half of life. Close your eyes and picture midlife crisis. What do you see? A 50-something man buying a red sports car he can't afford. A woman getting plastic surgery and dating someone half her age. Desperate, embarrassing attempts to recapture youth. Something to be mocked at cocktail parties and satirized in sitcoms. This is what modern culture has done to Jung's most profound teaching. They've turned a sacred psychological passage into a punchline. Jung would be horrified, because what he discovered about midlife had nothing to do with sports cars or affairs. It had everything to do with the soul's imprisonment in a false identity and the desperate need for liberation before it's too late. The real midlife crisis isn't about aging. It's about the psyche's demand for fundamental reorientation, from outer achievement to inner meaning. It's about the soul finally having enough strength to rebel against the persona's tyranny. Let me explain what Jung actually meant by persona, because most people completely misunderstand this concept. Your persona isn't just a social mask you wear at work. It's the entire false self you constructed over decades to meet collective expectations, gain approval, and survive in society. Your persona is the career you chose to impress your parents, the personality traits you developed to be likable, the parts of yourself you suppressed because they weren't professionally acceptable, the dreams you abandoned because they weren't practical, the whole elaborate performance of you that allowed you to function successfully in the first half of life. And here's the devastating truth Jung discovered. Most people at 55 suddenly realize they've spent 30 or 40 years building a life that isn't actually theirs. They've been living someone else's dream, playing someone else's role, performing in someone else's play. The career that seemed so right at 25 now feels like a prison. The relationships built on persona feel hollow and theatrical. The achievements that once brought pride now seem empty and meaningless. The identity that once felt solid now feels like an elaborate lie. This is what Jung called the noon of life, the moment when the shadow cast by your persona becomes impossible to ignore any longer, when the parts of yourself you sacrificed for success start demanding to be heard, when the soul begins screaming for attention. Modern psychology has completely missed this. They've pathologized it as depression, treated it with medication, and told people to think more positively. They've turned it into a medical problem to be solved, rather than recognizing it as a developmental necessity to be honored. The statistics tell the story Jung's clinical observations predicted. Depression rates spike in the 50s. Divorce rates for marriages over 20 years are at historic highs. Career changes and complete life reinventions become increasingly common. Existential crises, spiritual emergencies, and what researchers call meaning-seeking behaviors all escalate dramatically in midlife. But without Jung's framework, people interpret these phenomena as personal failure. They think something is wrong with them. They feel guilty for being ungrateful when they have everything. They assume they're having a breakdown rather than recognizing they're having a breakthrough trying to happen. The breakthrough is this: your ego identity, the one you've defended and built up for decades, was only ever meant to be phase one. It was necessary. You needed to develop a strong ego, establish yourself in the world, build competence and capability. The first half of life is about ego construction. But Jung discovered that around 55, the psyche naturally initiates phase two, ego transcendence. The same ego that needed to be strong now needs to become flexible. The same identity that needed to be solid now needs to become permeable. The same persona that needed to be impressive now needs to be released. This isn't decline. This is design. This is the human developmental arc operating exactly as it should. The problem is that nobody prepares people for this transition. We have elaborate rites of passage for adolescence, but nothing for the passage from first half to second half consciousness. So people hit 55 completely blindsided. They thought they were supposed to keep achieving, keep accumulating, keep expanding forever. They thought the morning's program was the only program. Nobody told them that the afternoon of life requires a completely different orientation. Jung wrote, "The curve of life is like the parabola of a projectile, which, disturbed from its initial state of rest, rises and then returns to a state of repose. The psychological curve of life begins at the beginning of life and ends at death. Birth and death are psychological events, not merely physical occurrences." What does this mean? It means your psychological development follows an arc. You rise, develop ego, achieve, expand, but only so that you can eventually return to a state of repose. Not the repose of unconsciousness you had at birth, but the repose of conscious integration you can only achieve after ego death. Most people never complete the arc. They keep trying to go up when the natural movement is toward return. They keep expanding when the soul wants to contract. They keep achieving when the psyche needs to integrate. They're fighting their own developmental trajectory. This creates massive psychological suffering. Jung compared it to trying to live summer's program in winter. You can do it, but it will exhaust you, deplete you, and ultimately destroy you, because you're violating natural law, not physical law, but psychological law. The suffering manifests in specific ways. First, there's the increasing sense that nothing matters. You accomplish something that would have thrilled you at 30 and feel nothing. The dopamine hit that used to come from achievement doesn't fire anymore. Success feels hollow. Second, there's the growing awareness of time's limits. You can't hide from mortality anymore. Every birthday feels heavier. You start counting years left rather than years lived. And this creates urgency that battles with meaninglessness. You're running out of time, but you're not even sure what you're running toward anymore. Third, there's the intensification of what Jung called the unlived life. All the parts of yourself you suppressed start demanding expression. The artist you abandoned for corporate success. The mystic you hid to seem rational. The rebel you tamed to be respectable. The lover you buried to be responsible. These unlived aspects don't just disappear. They accumulate in the shadow, gaining energy and eventually erupting. This is what's really happening in those cliché midlife crisis behaviors. Not regression to youth, but eruption of suppressed psychological contents that were never given space in the first half persona. The man buying the sports car isn't trying to be young again. He's acting out the freedom and spontaneity his responsible father persona never allowed. The woman having the affair isn't rebelling against her marriage. She's desperately seeking the passion and aliveness her perfect wife persona suppressed. The executive who quits to paint isn't having a breakdown. He's finally allowing his creative self to exist. But because we don't have a framework for understanding this as legitimate psychological necessity, people judge it as pathology. They shame the person back into their persona. They pressure them to act their age and be responsible. They reinforce the very imprisonment the soul is trying to escape. Jung saw this as cultural tragedy. He believed that when a society loses understanding of life's developmental stages, it creates mass suffering. And that's exactly what we have. Millions of people over 55 experiencing depression, anxiety, meaninglessness, and existential crisis because they don't understand what's actually happening to them. They think they're failing at life when they're actually being invited to the next stage of life. They think something is wrong when something is finally trying to become right. They think they're dying when they're actually being asked to be born, reborn, as their true self rather than their false persona. But the persona doesn't surrender easily. Your ego has been in control for 55 years. It's built an entire reality around its identity. It has investments in continuing the performance. The thought of releasing this identity feels like annihilation, which is exactly what it is. The persona must be annihilated for the self to emerge. The false identity must die for the true self to live. The first half programming must be deleted for the second half wisdom to download. This is why Jung insisted that midlife isn't a crisis to be solved, but a passage to be completed. You can't therapy your way out of it with cognitive techniques. You can't positive think your way past it. You can't medicate it into submission. You must go through it. The question is whether you'll go through it consciously or unconsciously. Consciously means understanding it's happening, working with it, allowing the death and rebirth. Unconsciously means fighting it, resisting it, and having it happen to you through crisis, illness, or collapse. Most people choose unconscious, not because they want to, but because they don't know. Conscious is an option. They don't have Jung's map. They don't understand that the depression is their soul demanding attention. They don't recognize that the meaninglessness is the death of their persona-driven motivations. They don't see that the crisis is actually an invitation, so they medicate the depression, which silences the soul. They distract from the meaninglessness with more achievement, which exhausts them further. They resist the crisis, which only makes it intensify, and they suffer through the second half of life when they could have been transformed by it. Jung believed this was the greatest human tragedy, people dying without ever becoming who they truly are, arriving at death with the soul still imprisoned in persona, living 70, 80, 90 years, and never experiencing actual freedom. Because here's what Jung knew: the freedom available in the second half of life makes everything in the first half look like slavery. The peace accessible after ego death makes achievement-driven satisfaction look agitated and superficial. The integration possible through shadow work makes persona performance look exhausting and false. But you only get access to these riches by surrendering everything you thought made you valuable. Your professional identity, your social status, your achievements and accomplishments, your need to be important, admired, or even understood. This is the price of admission to the second half's treasures, ego death. And most people look at that price and say no. They'd rather cling to their suffering than surrender their identity. They'd rather remain imprisoned than risk the freedom that lies beyond ego. Jung watched this refusal over and over in his practice. Intelligent, successful people who could clearly see their situation but couldn't bring themselves to release. And he documented what happened to them, which brings us to our first case study, a story that will show you the cost of saying no when the soul demands freedom. His name was Heinrich, though Jung changed it in his published work. Successful businessman from Zurich, 58 years old, who came to Jung's practice in 1932 with what his regular physician called severe anxiety of unknown origin. On the surface, Heinrich had everything modern society promises will bring happiness. He'd built a successful import-export business from nothing, employing over 200 people. He owned property, had a respected marriage, 3 accomplished children. By every external metric, he'd won at life. But internally, Heinrich was dying. He described it to Jung like this: I wake at 3 in the morning with my heart racing, certain I'm having a heart attack, but the doctors find nothing wrong. During business meetings, I have moments where I forget why I'm there, what any of it means. I look at my desk covered with papers and contracts and feel like I'm staring at hieroglyphics from an alien civilization. Jung recognized the symptoms immediately. This wasn't anxiety disorder. This was the soul in rebellion. During their first sessions, Jung asked Heinrich to describe a typical day. The man's schedule was relentless. Awake at 5, reviewing accounts. At the office by 6:30, back-to-back meetings until 8 in the evening. Home for a brief dinner where he discussed nothing meaningful with his wife. More work in his study until midnight. 4 or 5 hours of sleep, then repeat. When do you rest? Jung asked. I rest on Sundays, Heinrich replied. Well, I attend board meetings for the Cultural Foundation and the Businessmen's Association, but those aren't work. Jung wrote in his notes, the man has no relationship with his own soul. He exists entirely in persona, in collective function. The individual within has atrophied from decades of neglect. Over subsequent sessions, Jung began excavating Heinrich's personal history. As a young man, Heinrich had been artistic. He'd painted, written poetry, played violin, but his father, a stern businessman himself, had mocked these pursuits as feminine and frivolous. Heinrich learned to suppress his creative feeling side to win paternal approval. By 25, Heinrich had completely identified with the rational businessman persona. The poet within was buried. The artist was killed. The sensitive, feeling man was locked away in shadow. Only the hard-working, rational, productive persona remained, and it built an empire. But now, at 58, cracks were appearing in the empire, not in his business that was stronger than ever, but in his psyche. The suppressed parts of himself were demanding to be heard after 33 years of imprisonment. Jung explained this to Heinrich using his theory of the shadow. Every quality you reject and suppress doesn't disappear. It goes into the unconscious where it accumulates energy. Eventually, it becomes powerful enough to disrupt your conscious life. Heinrich's anxiety attacks were his buried creative, feeling self trying to emerge. Heinrich's response was resistance. I can't paint and write poetry. I'm a businessman. I have responsibilities. 200 people depend on me. My family depends on me. I can't just abandon everything. I'm not suggesting you abandon anything, Jung clarified. I'm suggesting you make space for the parts of yourself you abandoned. Your psyche is demanding integration, not irresponsibility. Jung prescribed a radical experiment. Heinrich should spend 2 hours every afternoon completely alone, not working, doing whatever called to him, painting, walking in nature, reading philosophy, playing music. Just 2 hours where he didn't perform the businessman role. Heinrich agreed intellectually but couldn't follow through. He'd schedule the time, then a crisis would emerge at work requiring his attention. He'd start the practice, then feel overwhelming guilt about being selfish when others needed him. Jung recognized this pattern. Heinrich was addicted to being needed. His entire identity rested on being indispensable, important, responsible. The thought of being nobody, just Heinrich, not the successful businessman Heinrich, terrified him more than death itself, which is exactly what Jung told him. You are more afraid of being nobody than of dying, but psychologically these are the same thing. Your persona must die for you to truly live. Heinrich couldn't hear it, or rather, he heard it intellectually, but couldn't embody it. His ego's attachment to the businessman identity was too strong. In Jung's notes, the inflation is massive. He believes he is the persona, rather than recognizing it as merely one aspect of self. To lose the persona feels like annihilation of existence itself. For 18 months, Jung worked with Heinrich. They analyzed dreams revealing suppressed creative impulses. They explored Heinrich's relationship with his father and the wounding that created the false self. They did active imagination work where Heinrich dialogued with the rejected parts of himself. Progress was slow. Heinrich would have breakthroughs in sessions, glimpses of a different way of being. He'd leave Jung's office inspired to change. But within days, he'd be pulled back into the relentless work schedule, the meetings and decisions and responsibilities that kept the persona inflated and the soul imprisoned. Jung's notes from their final session are heartbreaking. I fear this man will not make it. The resistance is too great. He cannot imagine existence without constant doing, without being important and needed. When I suggest withdrawal, simplification, he looks at me with genuine incomprehension, as though I'm speaking a foreign language. The tragedy is that his anxiety is the psyche's last-ditch attempt to force the transition. If he continues ignoring it, I believe his body will eventually force what his will cannot choose. 6 months after their final session, Jung received news. Heinrich had suffered a massive heart attack during a board meeting. He survived, but was severely compromised. The doctors ordered complete rest, no work for at least 6 months. From his hospital bed, Heinrich sent Jung a letter. You were right. My body has forced what I couldn't choose willingly. But even now, lying here unable to move, my mind races with business concerns. I cannot seem to stop, even when stopping is the only thing that might save my life. What is wrong with me? Jung wrote back, nothing is wrong with you. You are experiencing the natural consequence of living the first half of life's program into the second half of life. Your psyche demanded transition. You refused. Your body has now intervened. This is not punishment, it is intervention. You are being forced to stop so that you might finally learn to be. But Heinrich never learned. He survived the heart attack, but spent his convalescence planning his return to work. Against medical advice, he resumed full responsibilities within 4 months. He lived 2 more years in the same relentless pattern before a second, fatal heart attack at age 61. Jung wrote extensively about Heinrich's case in his lectures on the second half of life. He used it as a cautionary tale about what happens when the ego refuses the natural transition, when persona remains inflated beyond its developmental usefulness, when the soul's demands are chronically ignored. 3 key patterns from Heinrich's case appear repeatedly in Jung's observations. First, the anxiety and depression of midlife aren't medical problems. They're psychological signals. They're the soul's language trying to get the ego's attention. Medicating them or suppressing them doesn't heal anything. It silences the messenger while the underlying need intensifies. Second, addiction to being needed and important is one of the most difficult patterns to break in later life, because it masquerades as virtue. Heinrich genuinely believed he was being responsible and dutiful. He couldn't see that his responsibility was actually ego inflation. His duty was actually avoidance of inner work. Third, the body eventually enforces what the psyche demands. If psychological development is chronically blocked, physical symptoms emerge, not always immediately, but inevitably. Heart attacks, strokes, cancer, autoimmune disorders. Jung observed these appearing with suspicious frequency in patients who refused midlife transition. This wasn't mystical thinking on Jung's part. He understood that chronic stress from living against your psychological development creates physiological consequences. When you're constantly operating in resistance to your own nature, your nervous system remains in permanent fight or flight. Your immune system becomes compromised. Your cardiovascular system is perpetually taxed. Heinrich's case demonstrated another crucial point. You cannot think your way through this transition. Heinrich intellectually understood everything Jung was teaching him. He could articulate the concepts perfectly. But intellectual understanding means nothing without embodied change. The businessman persona had to actually die, not just be understood as a false identity. The schedule had to actually be radically simplified, not just recognized as too busy. The need to be important had to actually be released, not just acknowledged as ego inflation. This is where most people fail. They read Jung, attend workshops, discuss individuation theory, while continuing to live exactly as before. They mistake understanding for transformation. They confuse talking about ego death with actually dying. Heinrich never stopped. He couldn't, and Jung watched him rush toward a death that might have been avoided if he'd allowed the psychological death to happen first. But here's what makes Heinrich's story even more tragic. His death served no purpose. His business was sold to a corporation. His carefully maintained reputation faded within months. His children, who barely knew him beyond his role as provider, felt relief mixed with their grief. He'd sacrificed his soul for an empire that dissolved almost immediately upon his death. The question Jung wanted readers to confront: what are you sacrificing your soul for? What empire are you building that will dissolve the moment you're gone? What persona are you maintaining at the cost of ever knowing who you truly are? These questions become urgent at 55 because time starts running out. Heinrich had the heart attack at 58. He died at 61. He had 3 years where the soul screamed for attention, where the body tried to force the transition. But 3 years wasn't enough to overcome 58 years of persona identification. This is why Jung emphasized that the work must begin when the invitation first arrives. If you wait until crisis forces it, you may not have enough time to complete the transformation. The psychological death and rebirth takes years, 5, 10, sometimes 15 years to fully accomplish. But if you begin at 55, you potentially have 25 or 30 years to live in the freedom on the other side of ego death. If you wait until crisis forces it at 75, you might die before the transformation completes. Heinrich's story haunted Jung. He referenced it repeatedly in his later writings on aging and individuation. Because Heinrich wasn't an exception, he was the rule. Most successful, driven people in modern society follow Heinrich's pattern. They build impressive first halves, then try to continue the same program in the second half, then collapse under the weight of trying to do summer's work in winter, and they die with their souls still imprisoned, with the creative, feeling, authentic self still locked in shadow, with the psyche's treasures still buried, with the freedom Jung promised still unrealized. Let's see if modern research validates Jung's observations about what's actually happening psychologically and neurologically at this life stage, and whether science supports his claim that later life has its own distinct developmental purpose. Jung didn't have fMRI machines. He didn't have longitudinal studies tracking thousands of people across decades. He didn't have the neuroscience tools we possess today. Yet his observations about the 55 transition have been validated with stunning precision by modern research. Let's start with perhaps the most famous finding in adult development research: the U-curve of life satisfaction. Economists and psychologists studying happiness across the lifespan discovered something remarkable. Life satisfaction starts relatively high in youth, declines through the 30s and 40s, hits its lowest point around 50, then rises steadily from 55 onward. This pattern appears across cultures, countries, and economic conditions. The U-curve is universal, and it maps perfectly onto Jung's framework. The decline from 25 to 50? That's the period when ego identity becomes increasingly rigid, when persona demands intensify, when the gap between authentic self and social role widens. The low point at 50? That's the crisis point Jung described, when the soul can no longer tolerate imprisonment and begins its rebellion. The rise after 55. That's what happens when people either consciously or unconsciously begin releasing first-half patterns and entering second-half consciousness. The research shows that people who successfully navigate this transition report higher life satisfaction in their 70s than they experienced in their 20s. Let that sink in. Your 70s can be psychologically richer than your 20s, but only if you do the work Jung described. Now let's look at the neuroscience. Brain imaging studies reveal fundamental changes in how the aging brain processes experience. The younger brain is heavily weighted toward achievement orientation, driven by dopamine circuits that reward goal accomplishment and novelty seeking. This makes perfect sense for the first half of life, when you need to establish yourself, achieve competence, and build resources. But research by neuroscientist Dilip Jeste and others shows that around age 55, the brain begins naturally shifting away from dopamine-driven achievement seeking toward what they call wisdom-related neural activity. The prefrontal cortex becomes more integrated with limbic emotional centers, allowing better regulation of reactivity and more nuanced processing of complex situations. This isn't decline, it's sophistication. The aging brain becomes less driven by reward seeking and more capable of pattern recognition across long time horizons. It becomes better at holding paradox, recognizing context-dependent truth, and integrating multiple perspectives simultaneously. These are exactly the cognitive features Jung associated with the individuated psyche. The ability to hold opposites without forcing resolution. The recognition that what was true in one context isn't true in another. The integration of thinking and feeling rather than one dominating the other. In other words, the brain is naturally preparing for the second half's different kind of intelligence. Not the sharp, focused, goal-driven intelligence of youth, but the broad, integrated wisdom intelligence of elderhood. But here's the critical caveat. This transition only happens if you allow it. If you continue forcing your brain into pure achievement mode through relentless work and productivity demands, you prevent the natural integration from occurring. You essentially keep running first-half software on second-half hardware, creating the cognitive equivalent of system crashes, brain fog, decision fatigue, decreased processing speed. Research on what's called gerotranscendence, a concept developed by Swedish sociologist Lars Tornstam, provides another validation of Jung's teaching. Tornstam studied thousands of older adults and found that around age 55, people naturally begin shifting from a materialistic, rational worldview to a more cosmic, contemplative perspective. This shift includes decreased interest in superficial social relationships and increased value on fewer, deeper connections. Decreased materialism and consumer behavior, increased need for solitude and contemplation, greater acceptance of life's mysteries rather than need to explain everything rationally, increased sense of connection with past and future generations. These changes aren't cognitive decline, they're developmental progression, but they only manifest in people who allow the transition. Those who resist, who continue forcing first-half patterns, don't develop gerotranscendence. They just become rigid, brittle versions of their younger selves. Now let's talk about the longevity research because this gets fascinating. Studies following thousands of older adults over decades have identified the strongest predictors of healthy aging, and the results shocked researchers. It's not diet, it's not exercise, it's not genetics or cholesterol levels or blood pressure, though these matter. The single strongest predictor of healthy aging? Purpose in later life, specifically having what researchers call self-transcendent purpose, meaning that extends beyond your own ego concerns to something larger. People with strong later life purpose live significantly longer, experience less disability, maintain cognitive function better, and report higher quality of life. The effect size is enormous, comparable to the difference between smoking and not smoking. And here's what makes this so relevant to Jung's teaching. The research shows that later life purpose is qualitatively different from earlier life purpose. Young adult purpose tends to be achievement-oriented, career goals, raising kids, building wealth. Later life purpose tends to be meaning-oriented, contributing wisdom, supporting others' growth, creating legacy, spiritual development. This is exactly the shift Jung described. From ego-driven purpose to soul-driven meaning, from doing to being, from achievement to integration. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson, building on Jung's work, called this the shift from generativity, contributing through productivity, to ego integrity, achieving wholeness through self-acceptance and integration. His research showed that people who successfully make this shift experience what he called wisdom, which he defined as acceptance of one's life as it was lived, without regret or desire to do it differently. That last part is crucial. True wisdom, according to Erikson's research, isn't about becoming smarter or more knowledgeable. It's about accepting your life, including your failures, mistakes, and roads not taken, as necessary for becoming who you are. This is psychological integration, the reconciliation of all the contradictions, which Jung placed at the heart of later life individuation. More recent research on post-conventional consciousness provides even more striking validation. Adult development researchers like Suzanne Cook-Greuter and Robert Keegan have documented that a small percentage of adults, usually emerging after age 50, develop what they call post-conventional or autonomous stages of consciousness. These stages are characterized by transcendence of socially defined roles and identities, ability to observe the self-observing itself, meta-awareness, comfort with ambiguity and paradox, integration of shadow aspects previously denied, recognition that all perspectives are partial and context-dependent. Sound familiar? These are precisely the features Jung described as emerging through individuation, and the research shows they rarely appear before 50 and usually emerge only after significant psychological crisis or intentional inner work. In other words, the higher stages of human development, the most integrated, wise, and psychologically sophisticated forms of consciousness, naturally begin emerging in the second half of life. But their potential, not guaranteed. You have to do the work. Studies on encore careers, people who completely change vocational direction after 55, reveal another fascinating pattern. These aren't primarily motivated by financial need. People leaving successful careers to teach, do nonprofit work, create art, or pursue previously abandoned callings report that they're seeking meaning, not money. Researchers found that successful encore transitions follow a predictable pattern: disillusionment with current work despite external success, period of soul-searching and questioning, crisis or catalyst forcing confrontation, withdrawal period for reflection, emergence of new calling aligned with authentic values, re-entry at service of something larger than ego. This is Jung's individuation process mapped onto career transition. And the research shows that people who complete encore transitions report dramatically higher life satisfaction than those who continue in careers that no longer feed them, even when continuing means higher income and status. Now let's examine the flip side. What happens when the transition is resisted? Research on successful aging paradoxes provides sobering data, studies comparing people who age successfully, remaining productive, active, socially engaged, versus those who age wisely, contemplative, simplified, integrated, found something unexpected. The successful agers, those who maintain high productivity and activity levels into later life, often report lower life satisfaction and higher anxiety than their wise aging counterparts who've simplified and withdrawn. The successful agers are healthier physically, but more distressed psychologically. Why? Researchers hypothesize it's because maintaining first-half patterns requires constant effort against natural developmental flow. It's possible, but exhausting. You can keep achieving, but it doesn't feed you anymore. The dopamine circuits that once rewarded accomplishment are firing less, so you need more and more achievement for the same psychological payoff. This is the hedonic treadmill Jung warned about. If you don't make the transition to meaning-based satisfaction, you get trapped in achievement addiction, needing bigger and bigger accomplishments for diminishing psychological returns. Depression research validates Jung's observation that midlife depression is often misunderstood. Studies using meaning-centered therapy versus cognitive behavioral therapy for depression in adults over 55 found that meaning-centered approaches, helping people find purpose and integration, were significantly more effective than symptom-focused approaches. Why? Because the depression wasn't primarily about distorted thinking. It was about accurate perception of meaninglessness. You can't cognitive reframe your way out of the soul's legitimate complaint that you're living a false life. Palliative care research provides perhaps the most poignant validation. Bronnie Ware's famous study of dying patients' top regrets found that the number one regret was, "I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me." The number two regret, "I wish I hadn't worked so hard." These aren't random regrets. They're the precise consequences of what Jung warned about: refusing to release persona, maintaining productivity patterns beyond their developmental appropriateness, never becoming who you truly are. The people expressing these regrets weren't failures. They were successful people who maintained their first-half programming until death, and at the end, they recognized they'd wasted the second half of life. Research on spiritual emergence in later life reveals another dimension. Studies by William James, Abraham Maslow, and more recently by researchers at Johns Hopkins and NYU show that spontaneous spiritual experiences, mystical states, transcendent experiences, ego death, and rebirth occur with increasing frequency after age 55. These aren't pathological episodes. They're developmental phenomena. The research shows they're associated with increased well-being, life satisfaction, and psychological integration when properly supported. But they're often misdiagnosed as mental illness when they occur. Jung would not be surprised. He believed the psyche naturally becomes more spiritually attuned in the second half of life, not because you become religious, but because the ego's loosening allows awareness of deeper dimensions of reality. The self, in Jung's terms, becomes more accessible when ego inflation deflates. Studies on meditation and contemplative practice show fascinating age-related differences. Younger meditators often report achievement-oriented goals, better focus, stress reduction, performance enhancement. Older meditators increasingly report seeking self-transcendence, ego dissolution, and what Maslow called being cognition. This isn't because older people are taught different meditation, It's because later life naturally orients toward self-transcendence. The research validates Jung's claim that the psyche's goals shift fundamentally around 55. Neuroplasticity research demolishes the myth that the aging brain can't change. While certain processing speeds decline, the brain's capacity for integration, meaning-making, and wisdom actually increases with age. If you engage in the right practices, meditation, contemplation, creative expression, and active engagement with psychological material, all enhance neuroplasticity in older adults. In other words, you can teach an old dog new tricks, especially the trick of becoming who you truly are, which is the one trick that matters most. Research on mortality salience, how awareness of death affects behavior, shows that older adults who've integrated their mortality make more pro-social choices, prioritize relationships over achievement, and report greater life satisfaction. Those who remain in death denial show increased materialism, status-seeking, and anxiety. Jung's prescription of death meditation as essential practice for later life finds empirical support. Confronting mortality leads to better psychological outcomes, not worse ones. Finally, let's look at the collective data on aging populations. Globally, we're experiencing unprecedented demographic shift, more people over 65 than ever in human history. But surveys reveal a crisis. Older adults report increasing feelings of purposelessness, social irrelevance, and depression. Why? Because modern culture provides no framework for later life development. We've created societies that extend lifespan without extending psyche span, the developmental arc of psychological growth. People are living into their 80s and 90s, but psychologically arrested at 55, never making the transition to second-half consciousness. This creates what gerontologists call the longevity crisis. Not that we're living too long, but that we don't know what the extra years are for beyond continued consumption and healthcare utilization. Jung's teaching provides the answer. The extra years are for completing individuation, for achieving the psychological integration and wisdom that requires time to develop, for becoming the elders humanity desperately needs, but modern culture systematically prevents from emerging. All of this research, from neuroscience to palliative care, from adult development to longevity studies, validates Jung's core insight. The second half of life has its own purpose, requires its own practices, and offers its own rewards that cannot be achieved by extending first-half patterns. But validation isn't transformation. Understanding the research doesn't help unless you can identify where you are in the process and what specific transition you're facing or avoiding. Let's break down the 5 archetypal transitions that occur during the soul's preparation for freedom, so you can recognize which ones you're navigating right now. Jung taught that individuation follows archetypal patterns, not because humans are identical, but because the psyche's structure is universal. Just as everyone goes through adolescence but experiences it uniquely, everyone at 55 faces the same archetypal transitions while living them differently. Understanding these 5 transitions serves 2 purposes. First, you can identify where you are in the process. Second, you recognize that what feels like personal crisis is actually impersonal necessity. This alone reduces suffering enormously. Let's examine each transition in depth. Transition 1. From achievement to meaning. The first transition Jung observed was the fundamental reorientation from how much can I achieve to what gives life meaning. In the first half of life, achievement is the primary orientation. You measure your life by accomplishments, degrees earned, positions attained, wealth accumulated, recognition received. This isn't shallow, it's developmentally appropriate. You need to achieve competence, establish yourself, build resources. But around 55, something shifts. Accomplishments that once brought deep satisfaction start feeling empty. You get the promotion you worked toward for years and feel nothing. You achieve the goal and immediately wonder why you cared about it. The dopamine hit that used to come from achievement stops firing. This is the soul beginning to reject achievement as purpose. It's saying, that program is complete. Time for something else. The transition to meaning orientation involves asking entirely different questions. Not what can I accomplish, but what truly matters. Not how much can I accumulate, but what do I actually need. Not what will impress others, but what feeds my soul. These questions terrify achievement-oriented people because meaning can't be measured. You can quantify net worth, but not soul worth. You can count accomplishments, but not integration. You can rank yourself against others in achievement, but meaning is intrinsically personal and incomparable. Psychological mechanism. The psyche naturally shifts from dopamine reward circuits, achievement, to serotonin contentment circuits, meaning, in later life. But if you keep forcing achievement orientation, you create neurotransmitter dysregulation. The achievement doesn't satisfy anymore, but you haven't developed meaning-based satisfaction to replace it. Common resistances. But I have nothing to show for my life if I stop achieving. Meaning-seeking sounds selfish when others depend on me. I don't even know what meaning means. Achievement is concrete. Meaning is vague. If I stop achieving, who am I? Signs you're in this transition. Increasing apathy toward goals that once motivated you. Feeling empty after accomplishments. Questioning why you're doing what you're doing. Secret fantasies about completely different lives. Envy of people who seem content despite having achieved less than you. Navigation exercise. Keep a meaning journal for 30 days. Each evening, write one paragraph answering, what brought me alive today? Notice whether your answers are achievement-based, closed the deal, or meaning-based, had real conversation with colleague. The ratio reveals where you actually are. Historical example, Leo Tolstoy at 50, wildly successful author, wealthy aristocrat, international fame, yet he fell into suicidal depression because none of it meant anything to him. His achievement was massive but meaningless. Only when he shifted to asking, how should one live, and pursuing spiritual philosophical meaning did his depression lift. Transition 2. From persona to authenticity. The second transition requires the most courage, releasing the false self you've performed for decades and becoming real. Your persona is the collection of roles, masks, and performances you've developed to gain approval, avoid rejection, and function successfully in society. At work, you perform the consummate professional. At home, you perform the good parent or dutiful spouse. In social settings, you perform the likable, successful person others expect. These aren't necessarily lies. They're aspects of yourself, but highly curated and edited aspects. The persona leaves out everything that doesn't fit. Your doubt, your weirdness, your unacceptable desires, your rage, your grief, your wild creativity, your spiritual hunger. In the first half of life, persona is necessary. You need social acceptance and professional credibility. The persona gets you through the door, earns you opportunities, helps you establish yourself. Jung never said persona was bad. He said it was meant to be temporary. Around 55, the cost of maintaining the persona starts exceeding the benefits. It takes enormous energy to constantly perform, edit, and suppress. You start feeling like a fraud in your own life. The gap between who you really are and who you present yourself to be becomes unbearable. This is when the transition to authenticity begins. It means allowing the uncurated, unedited, real you to exist, even when it's socially awkward, professionally risky, or relationally uncomfortable. Psychological mechanism. Persona maintenance requires constant inhibition of authentic impulses. This inhibition is metabolically expensive, draining psychological energy. In youth, you have surplus energy for this. In later life, you don't and shouldn't. The psyche wants to redirect that energy toward integration rather than performance. Common resistances. Being authentic is selfish. Others depend on my persona. My relationships are built on who I've been presenting. If I change, I'll lose everyone. The real me is ugly, weird, unacceptable. I don't even know who I am beneath the masks. Signs you're in this transition. Exhaustion from being on all the time. Feeling like people don't really know you. Fantasizing about disappearing and starting over where nobody has expectations. Increasing inability to fake enthusiasm or interest. Moments where you forget to maintain the persona and feel both terrified and relieved. Navigation exercise. The one truth per week practice. Each week reveal one authentic truth you've been hiding, to yourself first, then to one trusted person. Start small. I actually hate golf but pretended to love it because my colleagues play. Progress to bigger. I've been questioning whether I believe the values I've been living by. Historical example. May Sarton at 59, respected poet who'd hidden her lesbian identity for decades to maintain literary respectability. In her journal at 70, she documented her decision to stop hiding, to be fully authentic about her sexuality and relationships. She lost some literary connections but gained wholeness, and her most creatively free work emerged in the decade following her decision. Transition 3, from expansion to simplification. The third transition inverts one of the first half's primary drives, the move from acquiring, accumulating, and expanding to releasing, subtracting, and simplifying. The first half of life is necessarily expansive. You acquire education, skills, possessions, relationships, responsibilities, commitments. You expand your career, your home, your social circle. You take on more projects, more roles, more obligations. This creates a life of tremendous complexity and stimulation. In your 40s, you might be managing career advancement, while parenting teenagers, while maintaining dozens of relationships, while serving on boards, while renovating your house. This is normal first-half complexity, but around 55, this complexity becomes oppressive rather than energizing. Every possession requires maintenance. Every relationship requires energy. Every commitment constrains freedom. Every room in the house needs cleaning. Every subscription needs managing. The soul begins craving simplification with increasing urgency, not because you're getting weak or lazy, but because inner work requires space, and your life is so full of outer obligations that there's no space for inner attention. This transition means deliberate subtraction, releasing possessions that no longer serve you, ending relationships built on persona rather than authenticity, resigning from commitments that don't align with your actual values, downsizing your home, reducing your schedule, creating emptiness, psychological mechanism, complexity taxes, attention and decision-making capacity. Research shows willpower and attention are finite resources that deplete with use. An over-complex life keeps you in constant external management mode, preventing the inward turn necessary for individuation. Common resistances. I earned these possessions and roles are relationships. Why should I give them up? People will think I'm failing if I simplify. My identity is tied to my complexity. Who am I with less? It feels ungrateful to release what I worked so hard to acquire. Signs you're in this transition. Fantasizing about minimalism or moving to a cabin. Feeling burdened by possessions instead of enjoying them. Avoiding your overflowing closet garage storage. Dreading social obligations that once excited you. craving large blocks of unscheduled time, feeling relief when plans cancel. Navigation exercise, the subtraction ritual. Every week, permanently remove one thing from your life. Week 1, a physical possession. Week 2, a commitment or obligation. Week 3, a relationship you're maintaining out of guilt rather than genuine connection. Week 4, a belief or opinion you've been defending but don't actually hold. Notice both the fear before releasing and the lightness after. Historical example, Jung himself at 58, he built his Bollingen Tower specifically as a space of radical simplification. No electricity, no modern conveniences, no telephone. He cooked simple meals, carved stone, and existed with minimal possessions. He wrote that this simplification was essential for his later life individuation. The complexity of his Zurich life prevented the inner work that Bollingen made possible. Transition 4, from doing to being. The fourth transition is perhaps the most difficult for modern people, learning to exist without constant productivity, releasing workaholism, and cultivating the capacity to simply be. The first half of life is defined by doing. You do things to establish yourself, prove yourself, achieve goals, earn recognition, provide for others. Doing is how you create value, how you measure your worth, how you justify your existence. Around 55, the psyche begins demanding that you learn to be without constantly doing, to exist without producing, to have value without accomplishing, to justify your existence simply by existing. This triggers existential terror in achievement-addicted people. If I'm not doing something, what's the point of me? If I'm not productive, am I worthless? If I just exist without accomplishing, does my life matter? The transition requires learning a completely different way of relating to yourself. Your value is intrinsic, not earned. Your existence is justified by consciousness itself, not by accomplishments. Being present, truly present, aware, alive, is enough. Psychological mechanism. Constant doing is often compulsive avoidance of being. If you slow down, you'll feel things you've been outrunning: grief, fear, emptiness, loneliness. Staying busy is defense against inner experience. The transition to being requires dropping this defense and meeting whatever arises. Common resistances. Being without doing is laziness. My worth comes from contribution. If I stop contributing, I'm worthless. Slowing down means death. I have to keep moving. My family needs my productivity. I don't know how to just be. It sounds boring and pointless. Signs you're in this transition. Inability to relax without feeling guilty. Filling every moment with activity or stimulation. Anxiety during unstructured time. Defining yourself entirely by what you do rather than who you are. Difficulty answering "who are you" without listing roles and accomplishments. Navigation exercise. Solitude Saturdays. 1 Saturday per month. Spend from morning until evening completely alone with zero productivity goals. No email, no errands, no exercise regimen, no reading with purpose. Just being. Walk without destination. Sit without agenda. Notice the discomfort, the restlessness, the urge to do something. Stay with it until it transforms into presence. Historical example, Thomas Merton at 45, premature version of 55 transition. Trappist monk and famous author who realized he'd turned even monastic life into productivity. He secured permission to live in hermitage, leaving even the monastery's structured schedule. In his hermitage journals, he documented learning to be without the doing of even spiritual practice, just existing in awareness, which he called his most profound teaching. The fifth transition confronts what underlies all the others, transforming death terror into mortality acceptance as a source of liberation and life appreciation. In youth, death is abstract. You know intellectually you'll die someday, but someday feels distant and unreal. This allows you to live as though you're immortal, to make long-term plans, assuming unlimited time. Around 55, death becomes real. Friends die, parents die, you have health scares. Your body reminds you daily that it's deteriorating. You can no longer pretend you have unlimited time. You probably have 25 to 30 years if you're lucky, maybe less. This can trigger one of two responses. The first is intensified death denial, anti-aging obsession, desperate attempts to stay young, refusing to discuss or think about death. Doubling down on accumulation and achievement as if they could somehow cheat mortality. The second, the individuated response, is moving toward death acceptance, not resignation or defeat, but clear-eyed recognition that death is real, inevitable, and actually illuminating. When you accept that your time is finite, everything becomes precious. When you acknowledge death, trivial concerns lose their power. When you befriend mortality, you're freed from wasting life on things that don't matter. Psychological mechanism. Death denial requires enormous psychological energy spent on avoidance and distraction. Death acceptance frees that energy for living. Additionally, genuine acceptance of mortality automatically reduces ego inflation. You can't maintain grandiose self-importance while truly confronting your impermanence. Common resistances. Thinking about death is morbid and depressing. If I accept death, I'll give up on life. Death acceptance means I've lost hope. It's healthier to stay positive and not dwell on mortality. I'll think about death when I'm actually dying. Signs you're in this transition. Increasing frequency of death thoughts or dreams. Visiting dying friends or relatives affects you more deeply. Health scares trigger existential questioning rather than just medical concern. Finding yourself calculating years remaining rather than years lived. Sudden urge to complete unfinished business or repair broken relationships. Navigation exercise. Morning death meditation. 5 minutes each morning contemplating, I will die, I don't know when. It could be today. What matters in light of this truth? Notice what becomes important and what becomes obviously trivial when held against mortality. Let this awareness inform your choices throughout the day. Historical example. Ernest Becker won the Pulitzer Prize for the denial of death at 49, then was diagnosed with terminal cancer at 50. His final writings documented his attempt to practice what he'd written about, accepting mortality rather than denying it. He wrote, "What man really fears is not so much extinction, but extinction with insignificance." His death acceptance work in his final year brought him more peace than his decades of death denial. Which transition are you in? Most people at 55 are navigating multiple transitions simultaneously, but usually one dominates. Read the signs listed for each and notice which resonates most intensely. That's probably your primary work right now. Understanding your specific transition helps in 3 ways. First, it normalizes what you're experiencing as developmental necessity rather than personal pathology. Second, it provides targeted practices rather than generic self-help. Third, it helps you recognize resistance patterns so you can work with them rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. But understanding transitions isn't enough if you don't recognize the dangers of refusing them. Let's explore what happens when the ego says no to the soul's demands, the escalating costs of resisting the 55 transition. Jung was not an alarmist, but he was brutally honest about consequences. In his practice and writings, he documented what happens to people who refuse the 55 transition. The dangers escalate because time becomes the enemy. The longer you resist, the less life remains for freedom, and the more severe the psyche's rebellion becomes. These aren't scare tactics. They're observable patterns Jung witnessed repeatedly. Let's examine each danger in detail. Danger 1. The living death. The first and most common danger is becoming what Jung called a living corpse, someone who continues functioning but is internally dead. You've seen these people. Maybe you fear you're becoming one. They go through the motions: work, home, routines, obligations. They're present physically but absent psychologically. There's no spark, no aliveness, no genuine engagement. They're automated, mechanical, hollow. This happens when you extend first-half patterns indefinitely without ever making the transition to second-half consciousness. You keep achieving, but it doesn't feed you. You maintain relationships, but they're performative rather than real. You stay busy, but the busyness is compulsive avoidance rather than meaningful activity. The living death is insidious because it's socially acceptable. Nobody confronts you because you're still functioning, still responsible, still meeting obligations. You might even appear successful, but internally you're dead and you know it. Jung observed that people in living death often develop what he called provisional life syndrome. They're living as though real life hasn't started yet. They're waiting for something to change, for permission to truly live, for circumstances to align. But they never take action to make it happen, so they wait forever, and real life never begins. Warning signs: going through days without remembering anything meaningful, feeling like you're watching your life from outside rather than living it. No emotional range, neither high joy nor deep sorrow, just flat numbness, difficulty recalling what you did yesterday because it was identical to every other day, secret certainty that you're wasting your life but inability to change it. Psychological mechanism: the living death results from chronic dissociation, splitting consciousness from experience to avoid pain. When you refuse the transition, acknowledging your true feelings becomes unbearable, since it would demand change. So you disconnect from feeling altogether. You numb yourself to avoid suffering, but thereby also numb yourself to aliveness. The tragedy: you can live decades in this state, 20, 30 years of mechanical existence where you're biologically alive but psychologically dead. Then you die biologically, having never truly lived. Real-world example: Jung described a patient who came to him at 72 after retirement. The man finally had time to face himself and realized he'd been dead inside since age 55. He'd spent 17 years in living death, waiting for retirement to start living. But by 72, he was too old and ill to do what he'd dreamed of. He'd waited until it was too late, Jung wrote. He died a few years later, bitter and full of regret. He never lived. He only waited. Danger 2. The bitter elder. The second danger is becoming the bitter, resentful, critical old person who poisons every gathering with negativity and judgment. You know this person. They complain constantly. Nothing is good enough. Everything is declining. The younger generation is terrible. The world is going to hell. They're critical, cynical, and destructive. Being around them is exhausting. They drain energy from everyone. This person isn't inherently bad. They're someone who refused the transition and accumulated decades of unlived life, unintegrated shadow, and suppressed grief. All that rejected material festers, and bitterness is the result. The bitter elder happens when you maintain persona without ever releasing it, achieve without ever finding meaning, and accumulate grievances without ever processing them. You become identified with what you didn't get, what others should have done, how life failed you. Jung noted that bitterness always contains shadow projection. The bitter elder criticizes in others what they rejected in themselves. They judge younger people's selfishness because they never allowed their own healthy selfishness. They resent others' freedom because they never claimed their own. Warning signs: increasing criticism and judgment of others. Nostalgia that romanticizes the past while denigrating the present. Belief that everything is declining from some golden age. inability to see positives or feel genuine joy, using complaints and negativity to connect with others, being secretly pleased when others fail or suffer. Psychological mechanism: bitterness is frozen grief and rage. When you don't process the grief of released dreams and the rage at your own soul betrayal, these emotions crystallize into generalized negativity. You're not actually angry at kids these days. You're angry at yourself for never becoming who you were meant to be. But that's too painful to acknowledge, so you project it outward. The tragedy: bitter elders die alone. Their toxicity drives away even family who love them. They spend their final years isolated, which confirms their bitter worldview that nobody cares, never recognizing that their own bitterness created the isolation. Real-world example: Jung had a patient in his 70s, a former professor, who came to therapy at his daughter's insistence. The man was destroying family gatherings with constant complaints. In therapy, Jung uncovered that the man had wanted to be a musician, but his family pressured him into academia. He'd suppressed this dream for 50 years. Now it erupted as bitterness toward anyone pursuing creative paths. He judged them as self-indulgent because he'd never allowed himself that same indulgence. Jung worked with him to grieve the unlived musician life, and the bitterness gradually transformed. But it took 2 years of hard work to undo 50 years of suppression. Danger. 3. The regret prison. The third danger is awakening late, at 70, 80, or on your deathbed, to realize you wasted the second half, clinging to first half values, and now it's too late. This is perhaps the most heartbreaking danger because it involves full awareness of what was lost. You wake up and see clearly. You had 25 years after 55 to become free, to live authentically, to complete your individuation, and you squandered those years defending a false self, pursuing meaningless achievements, maintaining a persona that never mattered. Bronnie Ware's palliative care research documented this precisely. The top regrets of the dying weren't about what they did, they were about what they didn't do. Lives not lived, selves not expressed, authenticity not claimed, risks not taken. The regret prison is unique because it's entirely psychological. You're not trapped by circumstances, you're trapped by awareness of wasted time. And unlike the previous dangers where you might die without awareness, in the regret prison, you die fully aware, which makes it excruciating. Warning signs: frequent thoughts that start with, "If only I had," or "Why didn't I?" Envy of people younger than you who are living authentically. Rage when you've wasted years that can't be recovered. Desperation to make up for lost time, often leading to frantic, ineffective activity. Grief so intense, it's almost unbearable. Psychological mechanism: the regret prison results from delayed awareness. For decades, you successfully suppressed awareness of your unlived life. Then something breaks through: diagnosis, loss, or simply hitting an age milestone, and you suddenly see clearly what you've done. The awareness crashes in all at once, and with it comes the full weight of grief for the life you didn't live. The tragedy: you might have 10 years left, or 5, or 1. You could still do some of the work, have some of the freedom, but the regret is so overwhelming that it paralyzes you. You spend your remaining time drowning in regret rather than actualizing whatever freedom is still possible. Real-world example: Jung described a woman who came to him at 81 after her husband's death. For the first time in 60 years, she didn't have to maintain the perfect wife persona. And for the first time, she saw what she'd sacrificed: her painting, her intellectual curiosity, her wild, creative self. She told Jung, "I could have been an artist. I had talent, but I chose safe over real, and now I'm about to die never having created what was in me to create." She wept with a grief so profound that Jung found it almost unbearable to witness. She died 18 months later, and Jung wrote, "She died with her song still inside her. This is the greatest human tragedy." Danger. 4. The premature death. The fourth danger is what Jung believed but couldn't fully prove, that refusing psychological transition invites premature biological death. The body rebels when the psyche's developmental needs are chronically thwarted. Jung observed that patients who refused the 55 transition often died earlier than those who embraced it, and not from old age, but from heart attacks, strokes, aggressive cancers, deaths that seemed to have psychological components, as though the body was enforcing what the psyche demanded. Modern psychoneuroimmunology research supports this. Chronic stress from living against your psychological nature creates cascade effects: elevated cortisol, compromised immune function, increased inflammation, cardiovascular strain. These aren't metaphors, they're measurable biological consequences. When you spend decades in fight or flight because you're resisting your own soul, when you chronically suppress authentic self-expression, when you maintain persona despite internal rebellion, your body pays the price. The stress of living a false life is metabolically expensive. Warning signs: unexplained physical symptoms that doctors can't diagnose, chronic fatigue despite adequate sleep, susceptibility to illness, stress-related conditions like hypertension, digestive issues, chronic pain, feeling like your body is wearing out faster than it should, secret sense that you're dying from the inside out. Psychological mechanism: the body and psyche aren't separate, they're one system. Psychological needs that go unmet don't just disappear, they manifest somatically. The depression, anxiety, and meaninglessness of refused transition keep the nervous system in perpetual threat response. Over years, this degrades every biological system. The tragedy: you might die at 68 instead of 85. You lose 17 years, but more tragically, you die without ever becoming free. The body's rebellion ends your life before the soul's liberation could begin. Real-world example. Remember Heinrich from our earlier case study? Classic example. Refused psychological transition, maintained driven persona, ignored soul's demands. Result: heart attack at 58, death at 61. Jung wrote, his body said what his ego refused to hear. Stop, but the ego wouldn't listen, so the body had to force the stop permanently. The escalation. These dangers escalate in severity and finality. The living death is reversible. You can wake up and begin the work. The bitter elder is harder but still workable, if you're willing to face your shadow and process your grief. The regret prison is much more difficult. You're working against time and the weight of lost years. The premature death is irreversible. You don't get a second chance. This is why Jung emphasized beginning the work when you first feel the invitation, usually around 55, not when crisis forces it at 65 or 75, not when diagnosis terrifies you into change. When you first notice achievement feeling empty, persona feeling exhausting, complexity becoming oppressive. The good news? Jung also provided the solution. A comprehensive blueprint for navigating the transition consciously rather than falling into these dangers. Let's examine his map for later life individuation, the practical process for preparing the soul for freedom. Jung didn't just identify the problem, he spent 30 years developing and refining the solution. His later life individuation blueprint has 7 integrated components. This isn't abstract theory, it's a practical process Jung himself lived and refined through his own transition from 55 onward. Understanding this blueprint is essential because generic self-help won't work for this transition. The practices that served the first half of life, goal setting, achievement strategies, positive thinking, often obstruct second half development. You need a completely different set of tools designed specifically for ego transcendence rather than ego building. Let's examine each component in depth. Component 1. The Great Withdrawal. The foundation of Jung's blueprint is what he called the Great Withdrawal, deliberately reducing external commitments, simplifying life structure, and creating space for inner work. This isn't retirement in the modern sense of endless leisure and consumption. It's strategic retreat from the collective's demands to focus on the self's developmental needs. It's choosing soul over society, being over doing, depth over breadth. Jung was explicit. You cannot do deep inner work while maintaining a life packed with external obligations. Individuation requires attention, time, solitude, and psychic space. If your calendar is full and your mind is constantly managing commitments, there's no room for the inner dialogue necessary for transformation. The Great Withdrawal has 3 dimensions. External withdrawal, reducing commitments, responsibilities, and social obligations. This might mean stepping back from leadership roles, leaving boards or committees, reducing work hours, declining social invitations that don't genuinely nourish you. It means ruthlessly prioritizing based on what serves your soul rather than what serves your persona. Relational withdrawal. This is delicate but necessary. You must release relationships built purely on persona maintenance, the friendships where you perform rather than connect, the family dynamics where you play a role rather than being yourself, the professional networks you maintain out of obligation rather than genuine care. Jung was clear. This doesn't mean abandoning all relationships. It means releasing false connections to make space for authentic ones. Often, when you stop performing, superficial relationships naturally fall away, while genuine ones deepen. Psychological withdrawal. This is the most important, withdrawing your psychic energy from collective concerns and redirecting it inward. Stop obsessing over news, politics, cultural trends. Stop identifying with collective movements and causes unless they genuinely align with your soul's calling. Stop letting the collective mind colonize your consciousness. Jung wrote, "The afternoon of life is just as full of meaning as the morning, only its meaning and purpose are different. Man needs what is most valuable in him. What's most valuable in you cannot be found in continuous engagement with the collective. It can only be discovered in withdrawal, both external and internal, where the noise quiets enough to hear your own soul's voice." Practical application. Begin with a commitment audit. List every obligation, responsibility, and regular commitment you maintain. For each, ask, does this serve my authentic values, or am I maintaining it from guilt, shouldness, or persona? Release 1 per month. Start small if necessary, but start. Create sacred hermit time, daily periods where you're completely unavailable. No phone, no internet, no people. Just you and your inner world. Begin with 30 minutes daily and gradually expand. This isn't selfish, it's essential. You're not abandoning the world. You're preparing to return to it as your authentic self rather than your false persona. Component 2, shadow reclamation. The second component is retrieving and integrating all the disowned parts of yourself that were suppressed to succeed in the first half of life. Your shadow isn't just your dark side. It's everything you rejected about yourself to gain acceptance and function successfully. For many people, the shadow contains beautiful qualities that weren't socially acceptable or professionally viable. The sensitive man who learned to suppress his tenderness to seem strong. The rational woman who learned to suppress her intuition to seem credible. The creative person who learned to suppress spontaneity to seem responsible. the spiritual seeker who learned to suppress mystical experiences to seem sane. Whatever you rejected to build your persona is waiting in shadow, and at 55, it wants back in, not to destroy you, but to complete you. Integration requires retrieving these exiled parts and giving them conscious space in your life. Jung's shadow work process, identification. Notice what triggers intense emotional reactions in others, strong attraction or repulsion. These reactions reveal shadow projections. You're seeing in others what you've rejected in yourself. The person whose spontaneity irritates you, your own suppressed spontaneity is in shadow. The person whose discipline you admire obsessively, your own suppressed discipline is in shadow. Dialogue. Use Jung's active imagination technique. Sit quietly, invoke the rejected quality as a figure, and dialogue with it. Let it tell you why it was exiled, what it needs, what it offers. Write both sides of the conversation without censoring. Example, if you suppressed creativity, imagine your inner artist appearing. Ask, why did I exile you? Listen to the response. It might say, you chose security over beauty, conformity over expression, but I never died, I just waited. Then ask, what do you need now? Let it guide you. Integration. This is the most challenging part, actually allowing the shadow quality to express in your life. Not just acknowledging it exists, but embodying it. The suppressed creative must actually create. The suppressed rebel must actually challenge authority. The suppressed mystic must actually explore spiritual dimensions. This feels dangerous because these parts were exiled for good reason. They threatened your social acceptance or professional success. But at 55, you must risk disapproval to achieve wholeness. The time for playing safe is over. Practical application. Create a shadow inventory. List 10 qualities you strongly criticize in others. These are likely projections. Now write, I reject this in others because I rejected it in myself. Then ask, what would it look like to reclaim this quality in healthy form? For example, I criticize selfishness in others because I rejected my own needs for others' approval. Reclaiming healthy selfishness means honoring my needs without guilt, setting boundaries without apology. Start embodying one shadow quality per month. If you suppressed playfulness, schedule play. If you suppressed anger, let yourself feel and express it appropriately. If you suppressed sensuality, explore it. Give the exiled parts space to exist. Component 3. Anima-animus integration. The third component addresses gender-based psychological splitting. Men must develop their feminine side, anima. Women must develop their masculine side, animus, to achieve psychological wholeness. Jung observed that the first half of life requires exaggerated gender identification. Men emphasize traditionally masculine qualities, rationality, independence, achievement, stoicism, while suppressing feminine qualities, feeling, receptivity, intuition, relationality. Women do the reverse, emphasizing feminine qualities while suppressing masculine ones, assertion, logic, independence, authority. This splitting is culturally reinforced and developmentally useful. It helps establish clear identity and function effectively in gendered society. But it creates profound one-sidedness. You're operating with only half your psychological capacities. Around 55, Jung observed the psyche naturally begins seeking balance. Men's suppressed feminine qualities start demanding expression. Women's suppressed masculine qualities start emerging. This can be confusing and threatening, but it's actually the path to wholeness. For men, anima integration means developing feeling function, learning to identify, honor, and express emotions rather than just thinking about them. Men often confuse thinking about feelings with actually feeling them. Integration means dropping into actual emotional experience, cultivating receptivity, learning to receive rather than always acting, to listen rather than always speaking, to be influenced rather than always influencing, to let things come to you rather than always pursuing. Honoring relationality, developing capacity for emotional intimacy, vulnerability, and interdependence. Many men only learn transactional relationships. Integration means learning to connect without agenda, embracing intuition and imagination, allowing non-rational ways of knowing, trusting gut feelings, symbolic thinking, and imaginal realities rather than demanding everything be logical and provable. For women, animus integration means developing thinking function, learning to analyze, critique, and assert intellectual authority. Women are often socialized to defer to others' thinking. Integration means trusting your own mind, cultivating assertiveness, speaking your truth even when it's uncomfortable, setting boundaries, saying no, taking up space, claiming authority in your own right, honoring independence, developing capacity to be alone, self-directed, and separate rather than always defined through relationships. Many women only learned identity through connection. Integration means discovering who you are apart from roles, embracing logos and order, allowing structured, strategic, and goal-directed qualities. Women are often socialized toward chaos, acceptance, and flow. Integration means also being able to impose order and direction. Jung emphasized, this isn't about becoming androgynous or gender neutral, it's about becoming complete, accessing the full range of human capacities rather than being limited to half of them. Practical application, identify which side, masculine or feminine, you've over-identified with. List qualities from the other side you've suppressed. Choose one per month to deliberately develop. If you're a man who suppressed feeling, start a feelings journal. Not thoughts about feelings, but raw emotional expression. I feel angry. I feel grief. I feel joy. Let yourself cry. Let yourself be tender. If you're a woman who suppressed assertiveness, practice saying no without explanation or apology. Practice stating opinions as facts rather than questions. Practice taking up more conversational space. The integration happens gradually through deliberate practice of the suppressed side. Initially, it feels fake and uncomfortable. Eventually, it becomes natural. You've expanded your psychological range. Component 4, Ancestral Reckoning. The fourth component is making peace with parents' lineage and generational patterns, releasing inherited wounds, and completing what Jung called the father complex and the mother complex. You cannot fully individuate while remaining psychologically entangled with parental complexes. For the first half of life, these entanglements are often invisible. You simply assume the patterns you inherited are just how things are. But at 55, they must be consciously examined and resolved. The father complex manifests as remaining in psychological rebellion against authority, unresolved father anger, or remaining in psychological submission to authority, unresolved father fear, choosing career, life path to please or spite father rather than express authentic self, inability to claim your own authority, because father's authority still dominates psychologically. The mother complex manifests as remaining emotionally fused with mother's needs and feelings, or remaining cut off from your own emotional life in reaction to mother's intensity. Inability to trust your own nurturing capacity for self or others, repeating mother's sacrificial patterns or rebelling against them without finding authentic alternative. Jung taught that ancestral reckoning has 3 stages: seeing clearly, recognizing how parental patterns shaped you, both the gifts they gave and the wounds they inflicted. This requires releasing the need to either idealize or demonize them. They were flawed humans doing their best, and their impact was profound. Releasing blame, understanding that holding on to grievance keeps you psychologically tied to them. As long as you're nursing wounds, you remain a child in relation to them. Forgiveness isn't about condoning what they did, it's about freeing yourself from their psychological grip. Completing what was incomplete. This is subtle but crucial. Often we unconsciously try to fulfill our parents' unlived lives. The son who becomes the artist his father wanted to be. The daughter who achieves the career her mother sacrificed. Jung believed you must consciously identify these unconscious inheritances and choose, is this genuinely mine or am I living my parents' unlived life? Practical application. Write 2 letters you'll never send, one to each parent or primary caregiver. In these letters, first letter, here's what you gave me that I'm grateful for. List genuine gifts, qualities, values, teachings that served you. Feel the gratitude. Second letter, here's what wounded me and how I've carried those wounds. List specific hurts and how they've shaped your patterns. Let yourself feel the grief and anger. Third letter, here's how I'm choosing to complete my own life rather than living yours. Identify where you've been unconsciously fulfilling their dreams or rebelling against their failures and declare your intention to live your own authentic path. This process isn't about sharing these letters with them. They may be dead, unavailable, or unable to receive them. It's about clarifying your own relationship to your inheritance so you can consciously choose what to keep and what to release. Component 5. Death meditation. The 5th component is regular contemplation of mortality, not as morbid obsession but as liberation from trivial concerns and clarification of what truly matters. Jung believed that confronting death is essential for later life individuation, not thinking about death in the abstract, but actually contemplating your own death as real, inevitable, and possibly imminent. This practice radically reorients your priorities. When you truly face mortality, certain things become obviously trivial. Status concerns, petty grievances, others' opinions, material accumulation, ego-driven achievements, and certain things become precious. Authentic connection, present moment awareness, self-expression, beauty, love, meaning. Death meditation isn't about becoming depressed or morbid. It's about using mortality awareness as a clarifying lens. In the Bhutanese tradition, they say, to be a happy person, one must contemplate death 5 times daily. This isn't depression, it's wisdom. Jung practiced this throughout his later life. After his near-death experience in 1944, at age 69, he wrote extensively about how mortality awareness transformed his relationship to life. Everything trivial fell away. What remained was essential. The practice has 3 forms. Morning death meditation. Begin each day with 5 minutes contemplating, I will die. Perhaps today, probably within the next 20 to 30 years. What matters in light of this truth? Let this awareness inform your choices throughout the day. Mortality journaling. Once weekly, write reflections on death. Not abstract philosophy, but personal contemplation. How do I feel about my mortality right now? What would I regret if I died today? What would I be grateful for? What must I do, express before I die? Deathbed visualization. Monthly practice. Vividly imagine yourself on your deathbed at the end of your life. Look back on your life from that vantage point. What do you see? What do you wish you'd done? What do you wish you'd released? What brings satisfaction? Then return to present and ask, what must change so my actual deathbed matches the one I'd be satisfied with? Practical application. Start with the morning practice. Set a timer for 5 minutes each morning. Sit quietly and simply hold the thought, I am mortal. My death is certain. The timing is uncertain. Notice how this awareness affects your feelings and priorities. Then, as you move through your day, periodically return to the question, if this were my last day, would this matter? Not to create urgency, but to create clarity. You'll find that many concerns simply dissolve when held against mortality. Component 6. Legacy Transcendence. The sixth component is paradoxical, caring deeply about your contribution while simultaneously releasing attachment to how you're remembered or whether your legacy persists. Jung observed that many people at 55 become obsessed with legacy, building something that will outlast them, ensuring they're remembered, creating monuments to their existence. This is ego's last desperate attempt to avoid death by achieving immortality through works or reputation. True individuation requires transcending this legacy obsession, not because contribution doesn't matter, it matters enormously, but because attachment to legacy is still ego inflation. It's trying to control the future, manipulate how you're perceived, and avoid the truth of your impermanence. Legacy transcendence means contributing from authenticity, creating, teaching, serving, or building from genuine calling rather than from need to be remembered. The contribution is its own reward. Whether anyone remembers your name becomes irrelevant. Releasing control of meaning. You cannot control how your work is interpreted, used, or remembered. Future generations will make of it what they will. Letting go of that control is freedom. Embracing anonymity. Some of the most important contributions are invisible. The conversation that changed someone's life, the moment of kindness that rippled through generations, the truth you lived that inspired others without your knowing. These leave no monuments, no accolades, no legacy markers, yet they're often the most significant contributions. Jung himself struggled with this. He wanted his work to be understood and continued. Yet in his later years, he increasingly released this attachment. He wrote, "I have done my work, and I am satisfied. What happens to it after I'm gone is not my concern." This doesn't mean not caring about quality or impact. It means caring about the work itself rather than caring about being remembered for the work. It means contributing because contribution is meaningful, not because it might make you immortal. Practical application. Legacy letters. Monthly practice of writing letters to future generations, expressing your integrated wisdom, what you've learned, what matters. But here's the key. These letters are never sent. They're not actually for others, they're for clarifying your own wisdom. Write as though teaching your great-great-grandchildren. Here's what I learned about being human. Here's what matters. Here's what doesn't. Then release attachment to whether anyone ever reads them. Also practice anonymous service, monthly acts of contribution where no one knows it was you. Give without credit, help without acknowledgement, create without signature. Feel the freedom of contribution without ego recognition. Component 7, spiritual opening. The seventh component is allowing connection to the self, Jung's term for the totality of the psyche, the transcendent function, and what Jung called the numinous, dimensions of reality that become accessible only after ego death. Jung was adamant he wasn't prescribing religion or any specific spiritual path. He was describing a psychological reality. When ego inflation deflates and the persona releases, you gain access to deeper dimensions of consciousness that were always present but blocked by ego's dominance. The self, capital S, is Jung's term for the organizing center of the total psyche, conscious and unconscious. The ego is just one small part of the self. For the first half of life, ego necessarily dominates. You need strong ego consciousness to function. But in the second half, ego must learn to serve self rather than trying to be self. This shift feels spiritual because it involves recognizing that your small ego identity isn't the totality of who you are. There's a larger intelligence, a deeper wisdom operating through you. Jung called it the self. Others call it soul, higher self, or divine nature. The terminology matters less than the recognition. Spiritual opening has 3 dimensions: ego-self axis, learning to listen to and follow self rather than ego. In practical terms, trusting intuition over rationalization, following what calls you rather than what makes sense, allowing synchronicities to guide you, recognizing that your life has purpose beyond your ego's plans. Transcendent function, developing capacity to hold opposites without forcing resolution, which allows a third thing to emerge: synthesis that transcends the original contradiction. Example, holding I matter and I don't matter simultaneously until a deeper truth emerges. My ego doesn't matter, but my participation in consciousness matters absolutely. Numinous encounter, remaining open to experiences that transcend rational understanding, mystical moments, synchronicities, encounters with what Jung called archetypes. These aren't pathology, they're the psyche's deeper dimensions becoming conscious. Jung experienced this profoundly during his Red Book period and after his near-death experience. He encountered archetypal figures, received visions, experienced states of consciousness that conventional psychology would call hallucination. But Jung recognized them as psychologically real, manifestations of the unconscious becoming conscious. Later life individuation often includes these experiences. Dreams become more vivid and symbolic. Synchronicities increase. You might encounter archetypal figures in active imagination or dreams. You might have mystical experiences or moments of cosmic consciousness. Jung's instruction: don't pathologize these, but also don't inflate around them. They're natural phenomena of later life psychological development. Respect them, learn from them, integrate them, but don't build a guru persona around them. Practical application: daily self-listening practice. 20 minutes of sitting in silent attention, asking, what does the self want me to know today? Then listening without agenda. This isn't prayer to an external deity. It's dialogue with your own deeper wisdom. Keep a synchronicity journal. Notice meaningful coincidences. When an answer appears right after you ask a question, when you think of someone and they call, when circumstances align in statistically unlikely ways. Don't force meaning, but notice patterns. Study one wisdom tradition deeply. Jung studied alchemy, Taoism, and Gnosticism. Choose what calls you. Not to believe it literally, but to understand the symbolic language through which the psyche communicates. Integration of the 7 components. These components don't happen sequentially. They happen simultaneously and recursively. You're withdrawing while doing shadow work, while confronting mortality, while opening spiritually. The process is messy, non-linear, and deeply personal. But Jung's blueprint provides structure for what would otherwise feel chaotic. You're not having a breakdown. You're following an archetypal pattern of human development. You're not losing your mind. You're preparing your soul for freedom. The question is, does this blueprint actually work? Let's look at historical examples of people who navigated this transition, contrasting those who resisted and collapsed versus those who surrendered and integrated. Theory is one thing. Real lives are another. Let's examine 4 historical figures who faced the 55 transition, 2 who resisted and paid terrible costs, 2 who surrendered and achieved profound freedom. Failure Case 1, Ernest Hemingway, the persona that couldn't die. Ernest Hemingway built one of the most inflated personas in literary history. The ultimate masculine man, warrior, hunter, drinker, adventurer, womanizer, brave and stoic. He wasn't just living this identity, He was performing it constantly, mythologizing himself into a legend. The persona served him brilliantly in the first half. It gave him confidence, material for his writing, and international fame. By his 40s, Hemingway was arguably the most famous writer alive, embodying a masculine ideal that millions of men envied. But around 1954, cracks appeared. His body, damaged by decades of hard living, could no longer support the adventurer persona. Injuries accumulated. His writing, always dependent on the virile persona, began to falter. He won the Nobel Prize in 1954, but couldn't write anything of quality afterward. The soul was demanding transition, release the inflated persona, allow the sensitive artist beneath to emerge, accept aging and mortality, find meaning beyond machismo. Hemingway heard this call. His depression and anxiety intensified throughout his 50s, but he couldn't surrender. Instead, he doubled down. He went on more hunting expeditions despite his body's protests. He attempted more dangerous adventures, including surviving 2 plane crashes in Africa in 1954. He drank more heavily, trying to maintain the hard-drinking persona, even as it destroyed his health. He pursued younger women, trying to prove virility even as it exhausted him. But the psyche wouldn't relent. His depression deepened. He underwent electroconvulsive therapy, which temporarily relieved symptoms but never addressed the underlying crisis. His entire identity rested on a persona that was no longer sustainable. Jung would have diagnosed this immediately. Ego inflation so extreme that death, literal death, felt preferable to ego death. Hemingway literally couldn't imagine being anyone other than the legend he'd created. A humble, authentic, quietly wise older Hemingway was psychologically impossible for him to envision. On July 2, 1961, at age 61, Hemingway shot himself. His biographer said he'd rather die than live as a sick old man. But Jung would say he chose biological death rather than psychological death. He chose to end his life rather than release his persona. The tragedy: Hemingway had potentially 25 more years. Had he allowed the transition, released the machismo persona, integrated his sensitive feeling side, found meaning beyond masculine performance, he might have produced his most mature work. His later life could have been his richest. Instead, he died with his soul still imprisoned in the persona he'd built at 25. The unlived Hemingway, the vulnerable, feeling-integrated man, never got to exist. Failure Case 2, Howard Hughes, Control Until Madness. Howard Hughes presents a different failure pattern. Rather than refusing to release persona, he intensified first-half patterns until they became pathological. Hughes was brilliant in the first half: aviation innovator, film producer, business genius. His pattern was control and accumulation, controlling his businesses, accumulating wealth, controlling his image, accumulating possessions and power. This pattern worked spectacularly until around his early 50s. But then, instead of transitioning toward release and simplification, Hughes amplified the control pattern. He became increasingly obsessive, germophobic, paranoid. He isolated himself, trying to control every aspect of his environment. By his 60s, Hughes was living in darkness, refusing to cut his hair or nails, surrounded by yes-men who enabled his pathology. He'd taken first-half control patterns and extended them into second-half life, where they became psychosis. Jung would recognize this. When you refuse the natural transition, the refused impulse doesn't disappear, it distorts. Hughes needed to release control and trust the unknown. Instead, he increased control until control became imprisonment. He died at 70, surrounded by wealth but completely alone, paranoid, and insane. He'd successfully maintained control of his empire but lost his soul entirely in the process. His billions couldn't buy the one thing he needed: freedom from his own ego's tyranny. The lesson: first half patterns taken into second half don't just fail, they become monstrous. Achievement drive becomes workaholism. Productivity becomes compulsion. Control becomes paranoia. Accumulation becomes hoarding. What once served you devours you. Success. Case 1. Carl Jung himself. The Bollingen Transformation. Now let's examine success. Jung himself provides the clearest example of conscious navigation of this transition. At age 55, 1930, Jung was established, successful psychiatric practice, international reputation, comfortable life in Zurich society. By conventional standards he'd arrived, but he felt increasingly constrained by his own success. He began what he would later identify as the Great Withdrawal. He reduced his patient load significantly. He stepped back from professional organizations and academic politics. He spent less time in Zurich social circles. Most dramatically, at age 58, 1933, Jung purchased land at Bollingen on the shore of Lake Zurich and began building his tower, a stone structure he largely built with his own hands. The tower became Jung's physical manifestation of later life individuation. It had no electricity, no modern conveniences, no telephone. It was radically simple. Jung cooked simple meals over a fire, carved stone, and spent long periods in solitude. In his autobiography, Jung wrote, "At Bollingen, I am in the midst of my true life. I am most deeply myself. I have done without electricity and tend the fireplace and stove myself. Evenings I light the old lamps. There is no running water, and I pump the water from the well. I chop the wood and cook the food. These simple acts make man simple, and how difficult it is to be simple." Notice what Jung was doing. Deliberate simplification, withdrawal from persona. In Zurich he was Dr. Jung. At Bollingen he was just a man. Shadow integration, allowing his primitive instinctual side to exist. And spiritual opening. He did extensive active imagination work at the tower. Jung spent increasing amounts of time at Bollingen from age 58 until his death at 85. His most profound work, his studies of alchemy, his writing on synchronicity, his reflections on religion and the self, all emerged from this later life period of withdrawal and integration. He released attachment to professional recognition. He wrote Answer to Job, knowing it would be controversial and upset religious scholars. He didn't care anymore about being acceptable. He explored alchemy for decades, knowing most people would think he'd gone crazy. He didn't need their approval anymore. Jung's later years were his freest. He'd released persona, integrated shadow, accepted mortality, and opened to dimensions of consciousness unavailable in his first half. His face in late-life photographs shows something you rarely see: genuine peace. He died at 85, having fully completed his individuation. His soul was free. Whatever you think of his theories, you cannot deny the authenticity of his later life freedom. He became who he truly was, and that was enough. Success Case 2. May Sarton, the poet who found herself at 59. May Sarton provides another powerful example, particularly relevant because she documented her transition extensively in journals published as Journal of a Solitude and at 70. Sarton was a respected poet and novelist, but until her late 50s she'd maintained significant persona, hiding her lesbian identity to remain professionally respectable, performing the role of charming literary figure, maintaining an exhausting social schedule. At 59, Sarton experienced what Jung would recognize as the crisis point. She fell into severe depression, feeling her life was false despite external success. She made a radical decision. She bought a house in rural New Hampshire and moved into deliberate solitude. Temporary retreat, it was permanent reorientation. She spent large portions of each year completely alone, writing, gardening, and doing the inner work of integration. In her journals, Sarton documented what Jung described theoretically. She wrote about releasing the need for approval. Now I am ready to tell how bodies are changed into different bodies. I am simpler as a human being. I think much more direct and honest. She stopped hiding her sexuality, writing openly about her relationships with women. This cost her some literary connections but freed her soul. She wrote, "It is only when we can believe that we are creating the soul that life has any meaning." Most remarkably, Sarton's most creatively free and accomplished work came after 60. Her poetry deepened. Her novels became more honest and powerful. She wrote, "The creative person, the person who moves from an irrational source of power, has to face the fact that this power antagonizes. Under all the superficial praise of the creative is the desire to kill." She was describing persona death and the fear it triggers in others. When you become authentic, people who knew your persona get uncomfortable. They want you to stay in role. Sarton refused and paid the social price, but gained soul freedom. She lived until 83, producing her best work in her 60s and 70s. At 70, she wrote, "I am more myself than I have ever been. There is less conflict. I am happier, more balanced, and more powerful. I felt small as a grain of sand, but also immense. I felt like nothing, but connected to everything. This is individuation, not grandiosity, but genuine connection to self, not ego inflation, but ego transcendence that paradoxically makes you more present and effective." The patterns comparing these four lives reveals clear patterns. Failure pattern, clinging to persona regardless of cost, Hemingway, or amplifying first-half patterns until they become pathological, Hughes. Result, premature death, Hemingway at 61, insanity and isolation, Hughes at 70, souls that never became free. Success pattern, voluntary withdrawal and simplification, Jung's Bullingen, Sarton's solitude. Releasing persona to become authentic, Jung shedding professional role, Sarton revealing her sexuality, integrating shadow and suppressed qualities, accepting mortality and finding meaning beyond ego. Result, creative flowering in later life, genuine peace and freedom, souls liberated before death. The difference isn't intelligence or resources. Both Hemingway and Hughes were brilliant and wealthy. The difference is willingness. Jung and Sarton were willing to die psychologically. Hemingway and Hughes weren't, so they died biologically instead, souls still imprisoned. One more contrast illuminates this even more starkly. Additional failure case. Elvis Presley died at 42, but his pattern is instructive. Elvis became completely identified with his persona, the king, and couldn't exist apart from it. When his body could no longer support the performance, weight gain, aging, illness, he self-medicated rather than releasing the identity. He died trying to maintain a persona that had become prison. He was biologically 42, but psychologically he'd already experienced the 55 crisis and refused it. Additional success case, Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, Harvard psychology professor who at 31 had his spiritual awakening, but the real transformation came later. At 66, he suffered a massive stroke that stripped away his teaching persona and physical capacities. In Still Here, he documented learning to be rather than do, finding peace beyond achievement, and accepting mortality. He wrote, "Aging is an extraordinary process, whereby you become the person you always should have been." He lived until 88, teaching from authenticity rather than persona until the end. These lives prove Jung's framework. The transition is real, the choice is real, and the consequences, tragedy or liberation, depend entirely on whether you have the courage to let your false self die so your true self can finally live. But understanding this theoretically still leaves a question. What was Jung's own experience like? Not just the outcome, but the actual process. How did he navigate his own dark nights, doubts, and terrors? Let's go deeper into Jung's personal struggle with this transition. Jung didn't arrive at his teaching about later life through theory. He lived it, including the terror, resistance, and profound transformation it demanded. Understanding Jung's personal navigation of the 55 transition is crucial because it humanizes him. He wasn't some enlightened sage dispensing wisdom from above. He was a man who struggled intensely with ego death, who resisted his own soul's demands, who faced the same fears everyone faces, and ultimately surrendered. Let's trace his journey in detail. The foundation, the Red Book crisis. To understand Jung's later life transformation, we must first understand what preceded it. From ages 38 to 44, 1913-1919, Jung underwent what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a psychological crisis so severe that he feared he was going insane. After his break with Freud, Jung lost his professional moorings. Without Freud's framework, he had to find his own. This triggered an eruption of unconscious material, visions, hallucinations, encounters with archetypal figures. He documented this in what became the Red Book. During this period, Jung descended into what felt like psychosis. He saw visions of blood flowing. Across Europe, this was 1913 before WWI. He encountered figures like Philemon, a wise old man who became his inner teacher. He experienced ego dissolution and terror that he might never return to normal consciousness. But Jung didn't just endure this crisis, he actively engaged it. He developed the technique of active imagination, deliberately dialoguing with unconscious figures. He drew, painted, and carved images from his visions. He took his breakdown and turned it into breakthrough. This crisis gave Jung the experiential foundation for his later theories about individuation. He learned that ego death doesn't mean actual death or permanent insanity. It's a passage. The ego must temporarily dissolve so a larger self can emerge. By his mid-40s, Jung had integrated this crisis and resumed his professional life. But the Red Book period taught him something essential. The unconscious is real, autonomous, and must be respected. You cannot simply impose ego will on the psyche. You must dialogue, negotiate, and ultimately surrender. This lesson would become crucial for his navigation of the later life transition. The 55 turning point. By 1930, age 55, Jung was professionally established and personally stable. He had a successful practice, international reputation, comfortable family life. The Red Book crisis was behind him, integrated into his theoretical framework. But Jung began noticing something disturbing. Despite external success, he felt increasingly hollow. His practice felt routine. His social obligations felt burdensome. The persona he maintained, the respected psychiatrist, the professional authority, felt like a costume he was tired of wearing. He wrote in letters from this period about feeling restless and unsatisfied, despite having everything he'd worked toward. He described a growing need for solitude that his Zurich life couldn't accommodate. He felt pulled toward something but didn't yet know what. Jung was experiencing exactly what he would later theorize about: the soul's demand for transition, from achievement to meaning, from persona to authenticity, from expansion to simplification. The decision. Building Bollingen in 1922, Jung's wife, Emma, had purchased land at Bollingen on the shore of Lake Zurich. But Jung didn't begin building his tower there until 1923, when he was 48, and he didn't make it his primary retreat until his 50s. The tower project is crucial to understanding Jung's later life individuation. He didn't hire contractors. He largely built it himself with his own hands, using stone. This was deliberate. He needed to work with matter, to be physical, to create something real rather than just theoretical. The tower went through multiple stages. Jung added sections over decades, each representing a different phase of his psychological development. By his late 50s, the tower had become his primary place of being. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung described the tower's significance. At Bollingen, I am in the midst of my true life. I am most deeply myself. Here I am, as it were, the age-old son of the mother. That is how alchemy puts it, very wisely, for the old man whom I had already experienced as a youth was my own age-old forefather. Notice what he's saying. At Bollingen, he could release the professional persona and exist as his archetypal essential self. Not Dr. Jung, the famous psychiatrist, but just Jung, connected to something ancient and timeless within himself. The tower had no electricity, deliberately, no telephone, no modern conveniences. Jung pumped water from a well, chopped wood, cooked over a fire, lit oil lamps at night. He was radically simplifying, stripping away everything non-essential. The practice, solitude, and stone Jung spent increasing amounts of time at Bollingen from his late 50s onward. He would go there alone for weeks at a time, living in complete solitude. He described his daily routine: wake early, pump water, make coffee, sit by the lake in meditation, spend morning hours writing or doing active imagination, afternoon physical work, carving stone, tending the garden, maintaining the tower. Evening cooking simple meals, reading by lamplight, early sleep. This wasn't vacation or retirement. It was deliberate withdrawal to create space for inner work. Jung was practicing what he would later prescribe: the great withdrawal, simplification, and solitude necessary for later life individuation. But it wasn't easy. Jung documented his struggles. He faced profound loneliness, doubt about whether he was wasting his time, fear that he was becoming irrelevant. His colleagues in Zurich thought he'd lost his mind, spending weeks alone playing with stones like a child. Jung had to constantly battle the voice saying, "You should be working, seeing patients, building your professional legacy, maintaining your reputation." The achievement drive, the productivity compulsion, the need to be important, these didn't just disappear because he understood them intellectually. They had to be actively resisted over and over. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires releasing who you've been pretending to be. And that release happens through sustained practice, not sudden enlightenment." The alchemical quest. During his Bollingen years, Jung became obsessed with alchemy. From his late 50s through his 70s, he spent thousands of hours studying obscure medieval alchemical texts. Most people thought this was eccentric or senile. What could modern psychology possibly gain from medieval chemistry? But Jung saw something profound. Alchemy wasn't really about transforming lead into gold. It was symbolic language for psychological transformation, specifically the transformation required in the second half of life. The alchemical process, starting with base matter, nigredo, blackening, breaking it down, solutio, purifying it, albedo, whitening, and finally creating gold, rubedo, reddening, perfectly mapped onto individuation. Nigredo is the dark night, the ego death, the confrontation with shadow. Solutio is the dissolution of false identity. Albedo is the purification and integration. Rubedo is the emergence of the self, the psychological gold. Jung recognized that medieval alchemists were actually describing their own inner transformations using the symbolic language of chemistry. And he saw that this process was specifically relevant to later life, when you must take the base matter of your persona life and transform it into the gold of authentic self. His magnum opus Mysterium Coniunctionis, published when he was 81, was his attempt to decode alchemical symbolism as a map for psychological integration. The book is dense, difficult, and largely ignored even by Jungians, but it represents Jung's deepest understanding of later life transformation. The crisis, near death at 69. In 1944, at age 69, Jung suffered a heart attack and broke his foot. While hospitalized, he had a series of near-death experiences, visions so profound they transformed his understanding of consciousness and mortality. He described floating above Earth, seeing the planet from space. This was 1944, before space travel. He encountered a temple in space and was about to enter when his doctor appeared. And Jung felt rage because he didn't want to return to life. He wanted to cross the threshold, but he recovered, and the experience changed him fundamentally. He wrote, "It was not I who was creating visions, but the visions that were creating me." After this near-death experience, Jung released even more attachment to professional reputation and collective concerns. He spent his 70s and early 80s almost entirely at Bollingen, writing only what interested him, caring less and less about whether others understood or approved. He published Answer to Job, a controversial book questioning God's morality, something the respected Dr. Jung would never have published in his professional prime. But the older Jung didn't care. He wrote truth as he saw it, regardless of consequences. The final integration, Jung's last years, from 75 to 85, represent complete individuation. He lived simply at Bollingen, saw very few people, and existed primarily in dialogue with his own depths. His housekeeper reported that he would sit by the lake for hours, seemingly doing nothing. When asked what he was doing, he'd say, "I'm being, not achieving, not producing, not proving, just being." He continued his stone carving until the end, a physical practice that kept him grounded while doing deep psychological and spiritual work. The stones he carved at Bollingen contain inscriptions, symbols, and images representing his inner journey. In his final interview, conducted shortly before his death at 85, Jung was asked, "Do you believe in God?" He paused, then said, "I don't believe, I know." This wasn't religious dogma, it was direct knowing, the fruit of decades of inner work, the result of complete individuation. Jung died at his home in Küsnacht on June 6, 1961, 5 days before his 86th birthday. His last years had been his freest. He'd fully released persona, integrated shadow, accepted mortality, and opened to dimensions of consciousness most people never access. What Jung's journey teaches Jung's later life journey reveals several crucial points. First, even understanding the process doesn't exempt you from having to live it. Jung knew the theory before he lived it, but he still had to do the actual work of withdrawal, simplification, and integration. Knowledge doesn't replace experience. Second, the process takes decades. Jung began his conscious later life individuation around 55 and worked on it until his death at 85. 30 years. This isn't a weekend workshop or 6-month program. It's the work of the second half of life. Third, it requires physical grounding. Jung didn't just do psychological work. He built with stone, chopped wood, cooked meals, pumped water. The individuation isn't purely mental or spiritual, it must be embodied. Fourth, solitude is non-negotiable. Jung couldn't have done this work while maintaining his busy Zurich practice and social schedule. He had to withdraw radically and repeatedly to create space for the inner process. Fifth, you must risk irrelevance and misunderstanding. Jung's colleagues thought he'd gone senile, studying alchemy and playing with stones. His reputation suffered. He didn't care, or rather he'd released attachment to reputation. This release was itself part of the freedom. Sixth, The freedom is real. Jung's late-life photographs show genuine peace that's unmistakable. This wasn't fake serenity or spiritual bypassing. It was hard-won integration. He became who he truly was, and it was enough. Jung's life proves his teaching. The transition is possible. The freedom is real, but it requires everything, complete willingness to release your false self so your true self can emerge. Now the question becomes practical. How do you actually do this? What are the specific actionable practices for beginning this transition today? Let's examine Jung's practical tools designed specifically for later life liberation. Jung was both theorist and practitioner. He didn't just describe individuation, he developed specific techniques for accomplishing it. Here are 8 practices designed specifically for those 55 and older or approaching to begin the soul's preparation for freedom. These aren't generic self-help techniques. They're Jungian methods targeting the specific psychological work required in later life. Each practice includes detailed instructions, the psychological rationale explaining why it works, and modifications for different circumstances. Practice 1. Morning death. Meditation, 5 minutes daily. The practice: set a timer for 5 minutes each morning before other activities. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, and hold these contemplations. I will die. My death is certain. The timing is uncertain. It could be today, this year, or in 25 years, but it will happen. What matters in light of this truth? What becomes trivial when held against mortality? If this were my last day, what would I most want to do, be, or express? Sit with these questions without forcing answers. Let them work on you. Notice what arises: feelings, insights, resistances. Psychological rationale. Mortality awareness naturally deflates ego inflation and clarifies values. When you truly confront death, status concerns and others' opinions lose their power. What remains is what actually matters to your soul. Jung wrote, "Death is the hardest thing from the outside, and as long as we are outside of it, but once inside you taste of such completeness and peace and fulfillment that you don't want to return." The practice isn't morbid, it's clarifying. Research shows that mortality salience actually increases life satisfaction, pro-social behavior, and meaning-seeking when processed consciously rather than denied. Modifications. If formal meditation feels too rigid, take a 5-minute death awareness walk each morning. If death language triggers trauma, use impermanence or my finite time. If this practice increases anxiety rather than clarity, shorten to 2 minutes and gradually extend. Expected progression. Weeks 1, 2. Discomfort, resistance, maybe increased anxiety. You're confronting what you've avoided. Weeks 3 and 4. Gradual clarity about priorities. 2 and 3. Natural shift in daily choices toward what actually matters. Months 4+. Deep peace from accepting mortality as liberation rather than threat. Practice. 2. The subtraction ritual, weekly release. The practice: every Sunday or chosen day, permanently remove one thing from your life following this 4-week rotation. Week 1. Physical possession you're keeping from guilt, inertia, but don't actually value. Week 2. Commitment or obligation you're maintaining from shouldness rather than genuine desire. Week 3. Belief or opinion you're defending, but don't actually hold. Week 4. Relationship you're maintaining from guilt rather than authentic connection. Don't just plan to release eventually. Actually do it that week. Donate the possession. Resign from the commitment. Publicly acknowledge the changed belief. Have the difficult conversation ending the relationship. Psychological rationale. Later life individuation requires making space, physical, temporal, mental, and relational space. Your life has accumulated 4 or 5 decades of possessions, commitments, beliefs, and relationships. Most no longer serve your authentic self. Jung observed that people resist subtraction because 1. Possessions represent ego identity. I am what I own. 2. Commitments provide importance. I matter because I'm needed. 3. Beliefs provide certainty. I know who I am because I know what I believe. 4. Relationships provide validation. I exist because others know me. Releasing these feels like death because it is death. Ego death. But it's necessary death to create space for self to emerge. Modifications. If weekly feels too fast, do bi-weekly. If 4-week rotation is overwhelming, start with only physical possessions for 3 months. If you live with family who will be affected, negotiate what's yours to release versus what's shared. Expected progression. First month. Difficult, guilt-inducing, you'll want to quit. Second month. Slight sense of lightness emerging. Third month. You start looking forward to release days, months 4 to 6. Subtraction becomes joyful. You realize how burdened you were. Months 7 plus. Your life is noticeably simpler and you have space for inner work. Practice 3. Shadow journaling for elders. 3x weekly, 20 minutes. The practice. 3 times weekly. Write dialogues between your ego self and rejected shadow aspects using this structure. Step 1. Identify the shadow quality you're working with. Creativity you suppressed, anger you denied, sensuality you rejected, etc. Step 2. Write from your ego self. Why did I reject you? What was I afraid of? Step 3. Write from the shadow quality's perspective. Let it respond in first person. I am your rejected creativity. You exiled me because... Don't censor, let it speak. Step 4. Continue the dialogue for 3 to 4 exchanges, letting both sides fully express. Step 5. End with integration question. How can I give you healthy space in my life now? Psychological rationale. Shadow integration is essential for later life wholeness. Whatever you rejected to build your persona is still alive in your unconscious and it wants back in, not to destroy you, but to complete you. Jung's active imagination technique allows direct dialogue with split-off aspects. Writing both sides prevents ego from dominating and allows authentic shadow voice to emerge. The shadow often holds qualities you desperately need now. The creativity you suppressed for corporate success, the assertiveness you denied to be likable, the spirituality you hid to seem rational, the playfulness you killed to be serious. Sample dialogue. Ego. Why did I exile my anger? Shadow anger. You believed nice people don't get angry. You thought anger would make you unlovable, so you swallowed me for 40 years. But I didn't disappear. I turned into depression, resentment, and passive aggression. Ego. What do you need now? Shadow anger. Permission to exist. Healthy expression. You must learn that I'm not rage or abuse. I'm your boundary enforcement, your self-protection, your power. Modifications. If writing feels too structured, draw or paint the dialogue instead. If shadow work triggers overwhelm, work with a Jungian therapist alongside this practice. If you're not sure what your shadow contains, start by listing qualities. You strongly criticize in others. Those are projections. Expected progression. Weeks 1 to 3. Awkward, forced, feeling silly talking to yourself. Weeks 4 to 6. Shadow voice becomes more authentic, less ego-controlled. Months 2, 3. Genuine insights emerge. You recognize shadow patterns in your life. Months 4 to 6. Integration begins. You start embodying reclaimed qualities. Months 7 plus. You feel more whole. Internal conflict decreases. Practice. 4. Persona shedding exercise. Weekly, gradually escalating. The practice. Each week, Deliberately remove one aspect of your persona performance following this escalating structure. Weeks 1-4. Remove superficial persona elements, clothing you wear to impress, speech patterns you use to sound professional, opinions you voice to fit in. Weeks 5-8. Remove behavioral persona, activities you do for appearance, social events you attend from obligation, personality traits you perform. Weeks 9-12. Remove relational persona, being who others expect in specific relationships, playing roles that aren't authentic. Weeks 13+. Remove core persona, the fundamental false self-identity you've maintained. For each shedding, write, "This week I'm releasing specific persona element. I maintained this because reason. Releasing it feels emotion. I commit to specific different behavior." Then actually behave differently that week and notice responses, both your own and others. Psychological rationale. Your persona is layered, surface performance to core false identity. You can't release it all at once without psychological destabilization. The gradual escalation allows manageable ego death. Jung emphasized that persona isn't inherently bad. It served crucial functions. But at 55, continuing to perform rather than be authentic is soul death. The practice teaches you can survive without the masks, and what's beneath is more real and valuable than the performance. Example, progression. Week 1. I'm releasing my perfect appearance clothing. I've dressed to impress for decades. This week I wear comfortable clothes regardless of how I look. It feels vulnerable and liberating. Week 6. I'm releasing my always agreeable persona. I've said yes to everything to be liked. This week I say no without explanation when something doesn't serve me. It feels selfish but necessary. Week 10. I'm releasing my competent professional persona in family relationships. I don't need to solve everyone's problems. This week I just listen without fixing. It feels uncomfortable but more real. Modifications. If you can't identify your persona, ask trusted friends. What role do you see me consistently playing? If shedding causes severe relationship conflict, slow the pace. If you're not sure what's beneath persona, try experimental authenticity days, where you just respond genuinely without filtering. Expected progression. First month, terrifying. You'll feel naked and exposed. Second month, some relationships strain, others deepen unexpectedly. Third month, relief emerges. Performing was exhausting. Months 4-6. You start discovering who you actually are beneath the roles. Months 7+. Authenticity becomes natural. You can't imagine going back to constant performance. Practice 5. Wisdom Council. Active imagination. Monthly, 45-60 minutes. The practice. Once monthly, conduct a wisdom council using Jung's active imagination technique. Setup. Find solitary space where you won't be interrupted. Light a candle or create ritual space to mark this as sacred time. Invocation. Close your eyes and imagine a circular council space. Invite 3 to 5 inner figures to appear. These might be your elder self, who you're becoming, a wise ancestor, real or imagined, an archetypal figure, old wizard, wise woman, sage, a rejected part of yourself that's gained wisdom through exile. Dialogue. Present a question or life situation you're navigating. Then let each council member respond in turn. Write or record what they say without ego interference. Don't make them say what you want to hear. Let them surprise you. Integration. After all have spoken, thank them and return to ordinary consciousness. Journal. What did I learn? What do I need to do differently? Psychological rationale. Jung discovered that the psyche contains multiple centers of consciousness, not just ego. Active imagination allows dialogue with these other centers, which often have wisdom ego lacks. The Wisdom Council specifically accesses what Jung called the self, the organizing intelligence of the total psyche. When ego asks and then listens without controlling the response, genuine wisdom emerges that you didn't consciously know you possessed. This isn't making things up. It's accessing deeper layers of your own consciousness that ego normally drowns out. Sample session. Question: should I retire from my career or continue for financial security? Elder self: you're not asking the right question. The question isn't should you retire, it's whether you're willing to live authentically regardless of financial consequences. Security is an illusion anyway. Wise ancestor: in my time, we worked until we dropped, but work was connected to meaning. Your work lost meaning a decade ago. Why do you continue? Rejected creative self: I've been waiting 50 years for you to give me space. Every day you delay is a day we never get back. Conclusion: the Council's unanimous message is clear. Financial security is ego's excuse for avoiding the transition. Modifications: if visualization is difficult, draw the Council members instead. If inner figures feel too woo-woo, think of them as different perspectives within your psyche. If you can't distinguish ego from Council voices, work with a Jungian therapist to develop this skill. Expected progression: first sessions, stilted. You suspect you're just making things up. Sessions 3 to 4, figures start responding in ways that surprise you. Sessions 5-8, genuine wisdom emerges that ego didn't consciously know. Sessions 9+, Council becomes trusted resource for major life decisions. You recognize it as your own deep knowing practice. 6. Legacy letter writing, monthly, never sent. The practice: once monthly, write a letter to future generations, your great-great-grandchildren or humanity in general, expressing your integrated wisdom. Follow this structure. Part 1, what I learned about being human. Part 2, what truly matters and what doesn't. Part 3, mistakes I made and what they taught me. Part 4, what I wish I'd known earlier. Part 5, my blessing for you. Write as though these are your final words. What wisdom would you want to transmit? Be completely honest. No persona, no impression management. Critical rule: these letters are never sent or shared. They're for clarifying your own wisdom, not for others' consumption. Date them and store them. Psychological rationale: Jung believed that later life's purpose is wisdom, integration, and transmission. But paradoxically, you must release attachment to being remembered or understood. Legacy letters accomplish both. They force you to articulate your wisdom, integration, while never seeking recognition for it, transcendence of ego need. Writing to future generations naturally shifts perspective. You can't write to people 3 generations from now from ego. Ego cares about immediate validation. You can only write from self, from what's truly essential and timeless. The practice also reveals what you actually believe versus what you perform believing. If you wouldn't write it to your great-great-grandchildren, you don't actually believe it. It's persona. Sample excerpt: dear ones I'll never meet, I spent the first half of my life accumulating possessions, achievements, approval. I was terrified of being nobody. Then, at 55, I began releasing everything I'd accumulated, and only then did I become somebody real. My blessing for you: may you learn this truth earlier than I did. You are already enough. You always were. Modifications: if future generations feels abstract, write to a specific younger person you know. If monthly feels too frequent, do quarterly. If writing is difficult, record voice memos instead. Expected progression: first letters, abstract generic wisdom. Letters 3 to 5, more honest, personal, specific. Letters 6 to 10, deep truth emerges. You start surprising yourself with what you know. Letters 11+, you recognize you've integrated substantial wisdom. The letters become transmissions of genuine elder consciousness. Practice 7. Solitude practice, weekly, escalating duration. The practice, schedule regular solitude time with 0 productivity goals, following this escalating structure. Weeks 1, 4, 2 hours, weekly, weeks 5, 8, half day weekly, weeks 9 to 12, full day weekly, months 4, 6, weekend monthly, months 7 plus, week-long retreat annually. During solitude, no phone, no internet, no books with agenda, no structured activity, just being. Walk without destination, sit without purpose, let your mind wander. Face whatever arises, boredom, restlessness, anxiety, grief, joy. The goal isn't relaxation or productivity, it's learning to exist without doing, to be comfortable with yourself, to tolerate the void where soul can finally speak. Psychological rationale. Jung was adamant. Individuation requires solitude. Not occasional alone time, but substantial, regular periods where you're completely with yourself. Modern life is designed to prevent solitude through constant stimulation and connectivity. This prevents the inward turn necessary for later life development. The psyche cannot speak when external noise is constant. Solitude practice deliberately creates the void, and initially, it's unbearable. You'll feel restless, anxious, compelled to do something. This restlessness is the addiction to doing, the compulsion to produce, the inability to just be. You must move through it to access the stillness beneath. Jung spent weeks alone at Bollingen doing nothing, and it was during this nothing that his most profound insights emerged. Modifications. If complete solitude triggers panic, start with low stimulation time. Nature walks with music. If you can't take full days off, wake hours earlier for solitude before family wakes. If annual week-long retreat is impossible, do multiple weekend retreats. Expected progression. First, solitude sessions. Excruciating boredom, constant urge to check phone, do something. Sessions 5-10, ability to tolerate solitude without panic. Sessions 11-20, restlessness decreases, occasional moments of genuine presence. Sessions 21+, solitude becomes nourishing rather than threatening. You start craving it. Long term, you recognize solitude as essential rather than luxury. You protect it fiercely. Practice 8, meaning audit, quarterly assessment. The practice 4 times yearly. Equinoxes and solstices work well. Conduct a comprehensive meaning audit using this protocol. Part 1, Joy Inventory. What brought me genuine joy this quarter? List specific moments, activities, connections that made you feel alive. Notice patterns. Part 2, Dead Spots. What felt dead, hollow, or meaningless this quarter? List what you did from obligation, habit, or shouldness that drained you. Notice patterns. Part 3, Emergence. Questions. What wants to emerge, but I'm not allowing space for? What keeps appearing in dreams, fantasies, or quiet moments? What's trying to be born? Part 4, Alignment Assessment. Is my life structure aligned with what brings meaning? Compare parts 1 and 2. If dead spots dominate, your structure is misaligned with soul. Part 5, Course Corrections. What 3 changes will I make next quarter to align with meaning? Be specific and commit. Psychological rationale. Jung taught that meaning must be regularly rediscovered. It's not static. What brought meaning at 55 might not at 65. Regular audits prevent drifting into meaninglessness through inertia. There comes a moment in every life when the architecture you've built begins to feel like a cage. Not because it was poorly constructed, often it was magnificent. Not because you chose wrongly, often you chose with all the wisdom you had. But because the soul that built that life is no longer the soul that inhabits it. At 55, something shifts in the deep places, a kind of restlessness that isn't solved by vacation or promotion or even love, a whisper that grows louder in the quiet hours, What if all of this, every achievement, every role, every certainty I've defended, was preparation for something I haven't yet begun? Carl Jung understood what our culture desperately tries to deny, that human consciousness doesn't arrive fully formed at 25 and then simply maintain itself until death. The psyche evolves. It moves through seasons as distinct as spring and autumn, each with its own imperatives, its own necessary tasks. And at the midpoint, somewhere in that territory between 45 and 60, a profound reversal occurs, what Jung called enantiodromia, the turning point where everything inverts, where the very structures that held you together begin to dissolve, where success reveals itself as a kind of beautiful imprisonment. In the first half of life, the task is clear and culturally celebrated. Build. Build identity, build security, build relationships, build career, build reputation, establish yourself in the world, prove your worth. The ego emerges from the chaos of childhood and adolescence like a hero claiming territory, and rightly so. This is necessary work. The young person must develop a strong ego structure, must learn to navigate reality, must establish autonomy and competence. The persona, that social mask we craft to interface with the world, must be carefully constructed. You learn what is acceptable and what is forbidden. You learn how to be loved, how to be valued, how to succeed. You learn to hide what doesn't fit, to deny what threatens your belonging, to push into shadow everything that might jeopardize your place in the world. This is not failure, this is survival. The child cannot afford to be wholly authentic, they must be loved to stay alive. The young adult cannot afford to be completely themselves. They must be employable, marriageable, acceptable. So you construct a version of yourself that works, and often it works brilliantly. By 50, by 55, you may have achieved everything you set out to achieve. The career you wanted, the family you built, the home, the security, the respect of peers. You did what you were supposed to do. You became who you were supposed to become. And then, in the stillness that success affords, a terrible question rises from the depths. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I want when I'm not performing? What calls to me that I've been too busy, too frightened, too committed to hear? This is the moment Jung recognized as the true beginning of psychological development, not the end, not the maintenance phase. The beginning of the second act, which requires a completely different script than the first, because at midlife the soul reaches a threshold that cannot be crossed with the same strategies that brought you this far. The ego that conquered the challenges of youth becomes an obstacle to the challenges of maturity. The persona that earned love and success becomes a prison preventing authentic connection. The shadow, everything you denied, rejected, suppressed to become acceptable, begins to press forward with urgent, undeniable demands. You may notice it first as a vague dissatisfaction, a sense that something is missing despite having everything you wanted, a restlessness that relationships and achievements no longer soothe. Perhaps it manifests as depression, not the sharp pain of trauma, but a gray fog of meaninglessness. Perhaps as anxiety, a formless dread that something essential is slipping away. Perhaps as sudden, inexplicable choices that baffle everyone who knows you. The successful executive who walks away from the corner office, the devoted parent who suddenly needs solitude, the rational person who becomes fascinated by poetry, mysticism, art. The culture pathologizes these emergences. Midlife crisis, breakdown, mental illness. Take medication. See a therapist who will help you adjust. Get back on track. Return to the life you built. But Jung saw something else entirely. He saw the soul's emergency intervention, consciousness calling to itself. The self, that deeper organizing principle beyond the ego, pressing forward, demanding recognition. Not breakdown, but breakthrough. Not crisis, but initiation. The psyche doing what it was designed to do: evolve, deepen, transform. At 55, you stand at the threshold between two fundamentally different ways of being human. Behind you lies the life of achievement, security, and external validation. The life organized around the ego's need to prove itself, the persona's need to be acceptable, the world's demands for productivity and performance. This was necessary. You could not have skipped it. But ahead lies something the first half could not provide: the possibility of actually living from your authentic depths, aligned with what Jung called the self rather than driven by the ego's desperate grasping. The transition is not comfortable. How could it be? Everything that gave you identity is being questioned. The relationships that defined you may need to be renegotiated or released. The career that consumed you may suddenly feel hollow. The beliefs that structured your worldview may collapse under honest examination. The parts of yourself you denied to succeed, your vulnerability, your wildness, your capacity for rage or tenderness, or creative chaos, these parts demand recognition now. They will not be silent anymore. This is what Jung meant by the shadow's uprising. For 50 years, perhaps, you've been splitting yourself, keeping the acceptable parts visible, pushing the unacceptable parts into darkness. The man who learned that tenderness equals weakness must deny his capacity for softness, for tears, for receptivity. The woman who learned that anger equals unlikability must deny her capacity for fierce boundaries, for holy rage, for self-protection. The person who learned that success requires constant achievement must deny their need for rest, for contemplation, for being rather than doing. The rational mind must deny the wisdom of emotion, instinct, the body's knowing. These denied parts don't disappear. They accumulate in shadow, gaining energy, waiting, and at midlife, when the ego's defenses naturally begin to soften, when success no longer fully distracts, when time reveals its finitude, the shadow presses forward, not to destroy you but to complete you, not to dismantle your life but to make it whole. The masculine man must reclaim his capacity for vulnerability. The caring woman must reclaim her capacity for healthy selfishness. The achievement-oriented person must reclaim the dimension of being that exists prior to and beyond all doing. The rational mind must acknowledge what the heart has always known. This integration is not about balance in some tepid sense. It's about wholeness, which includes the full range of human capacity: light and dark, acceptable and forbidden, conscious and unconscious. It requires the courage to look at yourself honestly, to acknowledge what you've denied, to reclaim what you've split off. And it requires something even more difficult: the willingness to release the identity you've constructed, the persona you've perfected, the ego structure you've spent decades building. There's a particular terror in this recognition. You may have 30, 40, 50 years remaining, perhaps more. This is not the beginning of old age. It's the midpoint of a potentially long life. The question becomes urgent. What will I do with the time that remains? Will I spend it maintaining the structures of the first half, performing the persona, defending the ego, denying the shadow? Or will I risk the transformation the soul is demanding, the descent into my own depths, the integration of what I've denied, the emergence of who I actually am beyond all roles and achievements? Time itself shifts meaning at this threshold. In youth, time feels infinite. You have your whole life ahead of you. Mortality is theoretical. But at 55, the hourglass visibly tilts. Half the sand has run. Perhaps more. Death is no longer abstract. It's a reality approaching with increasing speed. And with that recognition comes both grief and liberation. Grief for time already spent unconsciously, for years lived in performance rather than presence, for relationships maintained through roles, rather than genuine connection, but also liberation, the recognition that there is not time to waste on inauthenticity anymore, not time to spend on relationships that drain rather than nourish, not time to invest in work that means nothing beyond the paycheck, not time to maintain a persona that exhausts you. The archetypal energy shifts. The hero, that dominant archetype of the first half, focused on conquest, achievement, proving worth through external accomplishment, begins to exhaust its usefulness. The hero's task was to establish yourself in the world, and you've done it. But if you continue operating from the hero archetype into the second half, you become a parody, the aging warrior still trying to prove something, the eternal achiever whose accomplishments ring increasingly hollow, the person who cannot stop performing even when there's no audience left to impress. Other archetypal energies begin to press forward, energies that were necessarily suppressed in the first half but are essential for the second. The sage, who seeks truth over status, understanding over achievement, wisdom over success. The lover, who seeks genuine intimacy and connection rather than conquest or possession. The magician, who understands that real power comes from transformation, not control. The mentor, who finds meaning in serving others' development rather than proving their own superiority. These are not new personalities you need to construct. They are dimensions of your own psyche that have been waiting, dimensions of the self that can finally emerge as the ego's tyranny loosens. But their emergence requires something radical. The willingness to stop being who you thought you had to be. The willingness to disappoint people. The willingness to release certainties. The willingness to not know, to be lost. To descend into the underworld of your own unconscious and see what you find there. Jung himself lived this descent. In his late 40s, after his break with Freud, he entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of psychological upheaval so severe he thought he might be going mad. He experienced visions, engaged with inner figures, descended into psychic territories that terrified him. But he didn't pathologize it. He didn't medicate it away or try to return to his previous stability. He followed it. He documented it. He allowed the unconscious to speak, to emerge, to transform him. And from that descent came his most profound work, the understanding of archetypes, the individuation process, the recognition that the psyche's drive toward wholeness is the central organizing principle of human development. This is what awaits at 55. Not the beginning of decline, but the invitation to descent. Not the slow erosion of capacity, but the possibility of genuine transformation. Not the end of meaning, but its deeper emergence. The soul is preparing for freedom, not freedom from responsibility, which is spiritual bypass, but freedom from the tyranny of the false self. Freedom from living for approval. Freedom from defending an identity that was always partly performance. Freedom from the exhausting maintenance of a persona constructed for acceptance rather than authenticity. The myths speak of this threshold. Persephone's abduction into the underworld, terrifying, unwanted, yet ultimately initiatory. Inanna's descent, stripping away every attribute of her identity at each gate until she hangs naked and dead in the depths before rebirth. Orpheus's journey to retrieve Eurydice, learning that you cannot bring the old life back unchanged. The vision quest in indigenous traditions, the necessary separation from community, the solitary descent into wilderness, the encounter with death and spirits, the return transformed. These are not primitive superstitions. They are archetypal maps of the psychological territory you're entering. And there is no bypass. You cannot skip this initiation and arrive at authentic second-half living. You cannot maintain the first-half's script and access the second-half's wisdom. You cannot keep the persona polished and integrate the shadow. You cannot serve the ego's agenda and align with the self. At 55, the soul is asking you to choose. Will you cling to what has worked, defending it against its natural dissolution? Or will you surrender to what is calling, even though you cannot yet see where it leads? This is the beginning of freedom, and it is absolutely terrifying, because freedom, real freedom, means releasing the life raft of certainty and swimming in open water. It means disappointing people who need you to remain who you've been. It means entering a phase of genuine unknowing, where the old answers no longer satisfy, but the new ones haven't yet emerged. It means allowing yourself to be psychologically undone, so that something truer can emerge from the ruins. At 55, you recognize a truth you couldn't have accessed earlier. The victories of the first half have become the prisons of the second. The relationships that defined you may be constraining your emergence. The career that proved your worth may be draining your soul. The identity you constructed may be preventing you from discovering who you actually are. The certainties you defended may be blocking genuine wisdom. And the question that cannot be unasked rises with undeniable force. What if I stopped performing and simply lived? What if I released what I think I should be and discovered what I actually am? What if my real life hasn't even begun yet? The soul's preparation for freedom does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly in the spaces between what you've accomplished and what you've avoided, in the gap between who you appear to be and who you sense yourself becoming. At 55, as the ego's grip begins to loosen, not from weakness but from a kind of exhausted wisdom, something remarkable becomes possible. The very thing you've been fleeing since childhood, the disowned and denied parts of yourself, can finally be welcomed home. This is what Jung called individuation, not self-improvement, not becoming someone better, but becoming more fully yourself. Not the self you've constructed for approval, but the self that has been waiting beneath all the performance, patient and permanent as bedrock. Individuation is not a project. It is a recognition. You cannot force it or schedule it or achieve it through willpower. Those are the ego's strategies, and they no longer apply here. What you can do is stop resisting. Stop defending the fortress of identity you've spent decades constructing. Stop maintaining the persona that exhausts you. Stop denying the shadow that presses forward with increasing urgency. The psyche has its own wisdom, its own drive toward wholeness, and your task now is not to control this process, but to cooperate with it. The first movement in this cooperation is shadow integration, and it is humbling work. Everything you rejected about yourself to become acceptable, your anger, your neediness, your selfishness, your vulnerability, your wildness, your laziness, your grandiosity, your pettiness, these aspects do not disappear because you've denied them. They accumulate in the unconscious, forming what Jung called the shadow, the dark twin of your conscious identity, containing everything incompatible with how you've learned to see yourself. The successful person's shadow holds their fear of failure and secretly wishes to quit. The generous person's shadow holds their resentment and desires to receive. The strong person's shadow holds their terror and longs to collapse. The rational person's shadow holds their chaotic emotions and intuitive knowing. For 50 years, perhaps, you've been maintaining this split, identifying with the light, projecting the darkness onto others, seeing in them what you cannot acknowledge in yourself. The person who irritates you beyond reason likely carries something of your shadow. The people you judge most harshly reflect back what you've most strenuously denied. The qualities you adamantly insist you are not often indicate precisely what you are, unconsciously. This is not moral failing. This is how the psyche protects itself in the first half of life. You could not afford to acknowledge these parts and still succeed by society's measures, but now, at midlife, the cost of maintaining this split becomes unbearable. The energy required to keep the shadow suppressed exhausts you. The inauthenticity of presenting only acceptable parts creates a hollow sense of never being truly known or loved for who you actually are. Shadow integration begins with honest self-examination. Can you acknowledge the parts of yourself you've spent decades denying? Can you admit that beneath your generosity lives selfishness, that beneath your confidence lives insecurity, that beneath your independence lives desperate need? This admission is not about collapsing into these qualities or acting them out destructively. It's about recognizing them as part of your human wholeness. The shadow, when acknowledged, loses its destructive power and becomes available energy. Your denied anger, when integrated, becomes appropriate boundary setting and the capacity for healthy aggression. Your denied vulnerability becomes the capacity for genuine intimacy. Your denied selfishness becomes healthy self-care and the ability to receive as well as give. But this integration requires something the ego deeply resists: the willingness to be ordinary. The persona you've constructed is usually based on being special in some way, more capable, more disciplined, more virtuous, more successful, more caring, more rational. To integrate the shadow means acknowledging that you are also lazy, undisciplined, petty, failing, selfish, and emotionally chaotic. Just human, completely, ordinarily, beautifully human. And there is tremendous freedom in this ordinariness, this release from the exhausting requirement to be exceptional. As the shadow integrates, the ego must undergo its own transformation. In the first half of life, the ego necessarily believes itself to be the center of the personality. It experiences itself as the captain of the ship, the decider, the one in control. And for the tasks of the first half, establishing identity, building security, achieving goals, this ego strength is essential. But at midlife, this same ego structure becomes an obstacle. The ego that believes it is the center cannot access the deeper wisdom of the self. The ego that insists on control cannot surrender to the psyche's organic unfolding. The ego that identifies completely with consciousness cannot integrate the unconscious. The ego's realignment is not its destruction. You do not become egoless. That is a dangerous fantasy of certain spiritual paths. You need a functional ego to navigate reality, maintain boundaries, make decisions. But the ego must shift from tyrant to servant, from false center to conscious tool. The ego learns to serve the self rather than believe it is the self. This is a subtle but profound shift. You move from "I am my thoughts" to "I observe my thoughts." From "I am my emotions" to "I experience emotions." From "I am my achievements" to "I have accomplished things, and I am something prior to and beyond those accomplishments." This realignment often involves what feels like a kind of death. The person you thought you were, the identity you've defended, the story you've told about yourself, the image you've maintained, begins to dissolve. And before a new sense of self emerges, there is a period of genuine unknowing. You may not know who you are anymore. You may not know what you want or what has meaning. You may feel unmoored from the certainties that once structured your days. This is not pathology. This is the necessary dissolution that precedes genuine transformation. The chrysalis does not feel comfortable to the caterpillar, but without it, there is no butterfly. What emerges through this dissolution is increasing access to the self, that deeper organizing principle that Jung understood as the true center of the personality. The self is not something you create or construct. It is what you have always been beneath all the conditioning and performance and adaptation. Some traditions call it the soul. Others call it true nature or essence or the divine spark. Jung, approaching it psychologically rather than spiritually, called it the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, the archetype of wholeness and unity. In the first half of life, the self is largely unconscious. You may catch glimpses of it in peak experiences, in moments of flow or genuine presence in nature or art or love. But mostly you're identified with the ego, living from the surface. At midlife, as the ego's defenses soften and the shadow integrates, access to the self becomes increasingly natural. You begin to experience a sense of being guided not by conscious planning alone, but by something deeper. Synchronicities increase, meaningful coincidences that suggest an order beyond the ego's understanding. Dreams become more vivid and meaningful, offering guidance from the unconscious. Intuitions strengthen. You know things you cannot explain, sense directions you cannot rationally justify. This is not mysticism divorced from reality. It is the psyche functioning as it was designed to function, as an integrated whole rather than a fragmented collection of parts. When the ego stops insisting on total control and begins to listen, the self can finally speak. And what it speaks is not commandments or rigid rules, but something more like a calling, a sense of rightness, an alignment with your authentic nature. Relationships transform through this process. In the first half of life, relationships are often based on need. You need someone to make you feel worthy, complete, secure, less alone. You need someone to play certain roles: spouse, parent, friend, colleague, and you relate to them primarily through these roles. This is not wrong. It's developmentally appropriate, but it's not genuine intimacy. Genuine intimacy requires that you show up as a whole person rather than a collection of needs and defenses, and that you see the other person as a whole being rather than as a function or role. As you individuate, as you integrate shadow and realign ego and access the self, authentic relatedness becomes possible. You are no longer desperately seeking in others what you haven't found in yourself. You can love without needing to possess. You can connect without losing yourself. You can be intimate without merging. You can be alone without being lonely. Marriages that have been maintained through obligation or projection can transform into genuine partnerships between two people who are becoming fully themselves. Or they may end, not from betrayal, but from the recognition that you've grown in different directions, and continuing the form without the genuine connection would be a betrayal of the authenticity you're claiming. Friendships deepen or fall away. You have less tolerance for superficiality, for relationships based on habit or image rather than genuine connection. You may lose friends who need you to remain who you've been, who feel threatened by your transformation, who want the familiar version rather than the authentic one. This is loss, and it's painful, but you also discover, often to your surprise, that some people meet you in this new depth. That vulnerability invites vulnerability. That authenticity calls forth authenticity. That showing up as you actually are gives others permission to do the same. New relationships formed from this place of greater wholeness carry a quality impossible in earlier life. There is less projection, less idealization, less need to use the other person to complete yourself or prove your worth. You can appreciate people for who they actually are rather than who you need them to be. You can offer genuine presence rather than performance. You can receive without shame, knowing that interdependence is not weakness but the truth of human existence. Parental relationships often shift dramatically. If your parents are still living, they may encounter not the child seeking approval or rebelling against authority, but an adult who sees them as whole human beings, flawed, limited, doing their best with their own wounds and conditioning. This seeing can bring both grief and liberation. Grief for what they couldn't give, liberation from continuing to need it. And with your own children, if you have them, the relationship can evolve from role-based parenting to genuine adult connection. They encounter not the persona of mother or father, but a human being becoming themselves, which offers them implicit permission to do the same. The relationship with work transforms. In the first half of life, work is often about proving worth, achieving security, building identity. You are what you do. Your value is measured by productivity, success, advancement. This organization of energy served its purpose. You likely needed the security, the structure, the sense of accomplishment. But at midlife, continuing to derive identity and worth from work becomes increasingly hollow. You may continue in the same career, but the internal relationship shifts. You're no longer performing for approval or advancement. You're working from genuine contribution, from the question, what can move through me into the world? What is my authentic offering? Or you may discover that the work you've been doing for decades no longer aligns with who you're becoming. This recognition can be terrifying, walking away from career investment, financial security, professional identity. But many who make this shift report not regret, but relief. The energy previously spent maintaining a misaligned life becomes available for what actually calls to them. This is not irresponsibility or self-indulgence. It's alignment with the psyche's deepest imperative toward authenticity and meaning. Meaning itself shifts from achievement to contribution, from success to significance, from what have I accomplished to what is moving through me. The question becomes less, how can I prove my worth? And more, what wants to emerge through my unique configuration of gifts, wounds, experience, and awareness? This is the archetype of the sage emerging, the hunger for truth over status, for wisdom over success, for understanding rather than accumulation. The lover archetype deepens as well, not lover in the narrow sexual sense, but in the broader sense of passionate engagement with life, genuine intimacy with reality as it is, rather than as you wish it to be. There is capacity for pleasure without guilt, for enjoyment without needing to justify it through productivity, for beauty without needing to possess it, for connection that honors both self and other, for desire that is integrated rather than split off or acted out compulsively. The mentor archetype activates the genuine desire to serve others' development without needing to control it or take credit for it. In the first half, teaching or mentoring is often contaminated by the ego's need to be superior, to have followers, to be recognized as expert. In the second half, true mentorship becomes possible. Seeing the potential in another, creating space for their emergence, offering hard-won wisdom without attachment to whether they take it. This is generativity in Erik Erikson's sense, the capacity to contribute to the next generation, not from obligation, but from genuine care for the ongoing human project. Time itself undergoes a transfiguration. The finitude that initially catalyzed fear becomes a teacher. You have perhaps 30 or 40 or 50 years remaining, still a significant portion of life, still enough time to live deeply and contribute meaningfully, but not infinite time, not time to waste on inauthenticity, on relationships that drain you, on work that means nothing, on performance that exhausts you. Mortality, rather than being denied or feared, becomes the clarifying force that reveals what actually matters. There is less future orientation, less living for some imagined moment when things will finally be right. More capacity for presence, for experiencing this moment as it is, rather than as a stepping stone to somewhere else. The young person lives for the future. I'll be happy when I get the degree, the job, the partner, the house. The person at midlife recognizes that life is now or never, that this moment, with all its ordinariness and imperfection, is the only moment you have, that postponing genuine living for some more convenient time is a choice to never live at all. New capacities emerge that were simply unavailable in the first half. The capacity to hold paradox and ambiguity, without needing to resolve it, to live with uncertainty without it destroying your sense of meaning, to acknowledge "I don't know" without experiencing it as failure, to see multiple truths simultaneously, to recognize that the opposite of a profound truth is often another profound truth. This is the transcendent function deepening, the psyche's capacity to integrate opposites rather than split them into good, bad, right, wrong, acceptable, unacceptable. The capacity to see others clearly without needing to change them, to witness someone's pain or limitation without rushing in to fix it or taking responsibility for it, to allow people to make choices you wouldn't make without judgment or rejection, to recognize that everyone is on their own journey of becoming, operating with the consciousness they currently have access to, doing the best they can with their current wounds and gifts, the capacity to fail without it threatening your fundamental worth. In the first half, failure often feels catastrophic because worth is so tied to achievement and success. By midlife, with shadow integrated and ego realigned, failure becomes information rather than verdict. You can attempt things knowing you might fail, take risks without needing guaranteed outcomes, learn from mistakes without shame destroying you, the capacity to receive without needing to maintain the illusion of self-sufficiency, to acknowledge limitation without experiencing it as defeat, to ask for help, to accept care, to be vulnerable. The hero must appear invulnerable. The individuating person recognizes that vulnerability is strength, that interdependence is truth, that receiving is as sacred as giving. The capacity to know yourself, not the idealized self, not the persona, but your actual nature with all its light and shadow, gifts and wounds, capacities and limitations. This self-knowledge is the prerequisite for genuine humility and genuine generosity. Humility not as self-deprecation, but as accurate self-assessment. Knowing what you can genuinely offer and what you cannot. Knowing your gifts without inflating them and your limitations without shame. Generosity not as self-sacrifice, but as natural overflow. Giving from fullness rather than emptiness. Serving from wholeness rather than proving your worth through martyrdom. What becomes possible in the second half is the life you could not have lived in the first, not because you lacked time or opportunity, but because you lacked the consciousness. The first half required ego development, persona construction, shadow formation, external achievement. These were necessary stages. You could not have skipped them, but they were preparation, not completion. The second half offers what the first half could not. Genuine presence, authentic relatedness, meaningful contribution flowing from alignment rather than compulsion, freedom within constraint, wholeness including all parts rather than performance of acceptable parts. Jung himself continued developing, deepening, contributing into his 80s. His most mature work emerged in his later years, not despite aging but because of it, from the consciousness that only the second half makes possible. He understood that human development does not plateau at ego consolidation. That continues to unfold if you allow it, deepens if you cooperate with it, enriches if you surrender to it. The freedom the soul prepares for is paradoxical. It is not freedom from life's constraints and responsibilities and limits. You do not become invulnerable to pain or immune to loss or exempt from aging and death. You may remain in the same marriage, the same work, the same home, but the subjective experience is utterly transformed. These are now chosen from consciousness rather than endured from unconsciousness, inhabited authentically rather than performed reluctantly. The constraints are accepted as part of reality rather than fought as limitations. This is freedom within form rather than freedom from form. The freedom to be fully present in your life because you're finally living it as yourself rather than as a construction. The freedom to love genuinely because you're no longer using others to complete yourself. the freedom to work meaningfully because it flows from authentic contribution rather than desperate proving, the freedom to fail, to be ordinary, to not know, to need help, to be completely, messily, beautifully human. At 55, the soul's preparation is an invitation the ego cannot generate on its own. It arises from the self, from consciousness calling to itself, from the psyche's innate drive toward wholeness, asserting itself with increasing urgency. You can resist. Many do, maintaining the first half's script until death, dying with their authentic self unexpressed, their shadow unintegrated, their depths unplumbed. Or you can surrender, not passive resignation, but active cooperation with your own becoming, with the transformation the soul demands, with the freedom that awaits on the other side of everything you thought you had to be. What if your real life hasn't begun yet? What if the first 55 years were preparation, necessary, valuable preparation, and the second half is the actual unfolding? What if the freedom the soul is preparing for is not escape from life's demands, but entry into life itself, finally, authentically, while time remains? At 55, the answer depends entirely on whether you can release your grip on who you've been and trust the emergence of who you're becoming. The soul is preparing. The question is, are you willing?